long before iron rang beneath the hands of kings, before cities cast shadows across the earth, there was a gentler sound in the world, the quiet tap of stone against a green-veined rock. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. The earth did not shatter, it softened, it yielded. Fire learned a new language, and humanity took its first step away from stone and into transformation. Tonight, you will drift back to that ancient moment. You will wander through valleys where the air once smelled of smoke and rain, through villages that slept beneath endless constellations, and into an age when metal itself felt like magic. Let the present fade. Let time loosen its grip. This is the first metal dream. Welcome, traveler, to Somni-Kron, where history becomes a place to rest. Here, the past does not rush, it breathes. It glows softly like embers settling in a quiet hearth. If these journeys through time bring you comfort, you may leave a small trace before you drift away, a gentle like, a place among those who return, or a few soft words in the comments as though whispering to the night. Not for noise, not for urgency. Only so this fire of stories continues to glow for those who wander here in search of sleep. Now let your shoulders sink. Let the world grow distant. The age we enter tonight is ancient, patient, and ready to carry you into rest. The first people who discovered copper did not know they were changing the course of history. They were farmers tending quiet fields, hunters tracing animal paths through tall grass, artisans shaping flint beneath open skies. In the hills of Anatolia, where wind moved gently over stone and wildflowers bloomed between rocks, small nuggets of green and blue shimmered in the earth. These stones were different. When struck, they did not fracture like flint. They bent, they remembered the touch. Curious hands lifted them from the soil and carried them back to warm hearths where evening fires glowed and shadows danced along clay walls. There, beside families and flickering flames, these early experimenters began to strike the metal with stone hammers. Each tap was tentative at first, then more confident. The copper flattened, stretched, and slowly transformed. No one taught them this. There were no books, no masters, only observation and wonder. They learned that too much striking made the metal tired and brittle, and that heat from the fire restored its softness. They did not know the word annealing, yet they practiced it by instinct. Fire became a companion in creation, not just warmth or light, but a partner in shaping the earth itself. In villages like Satalhöyük, where homes pressed close together and people moved across rooftops under open skies, copper objects began to appear. Small beads caught the light, pins fastened cloaks, simple tools rested beside grinding stones and baskets of grain. These items were rare, precious not for wealth, but for what they represented, a quiet leap beyond what had always been. Yet not every household worked copper. Knowledge gathered in certain hands. Some families learned the rhythms of fire and metal. Others traded for these glowing objects. And in this gentle imbalance, something new stirred. The world had begun almost imperceptibly to change. As copper began to flow quietly through villages and valleys, the world itself seemed to shift in response. Seasons grew less predictable, rains wandered, harvests faltered. Around the time when 5,000 years still lay between humanity and the present, a cooling breath passed over the land. Fields yielded less. Winters lingered longer. Communities that had once lived comfortably within the rhythms of stone tools now felt the subtle weight of uncertainty. It was during these moments of pressure that copper revealed its true value, a blade that stayed sharp a little longer, a needle that pierced hide with gentler ease, a tool that did not shatter when struck. These small advantages became anchors in an unsteady world. Paths between settlements grew more defined. Rivers became corridors of exchange. Copper began to travel farther than voices ever could. It moved in pouches and baskets, wrapped in cloth, tucked against skin. With it traveled stories of distant hills where the earth glimmered green, of fires that burned hotter, of hands that knew how to coax metal into form. Trade slowly stitched together communities that had once lived in isolation. Along these routes, certain places began to change. Villages near copper sources became hubs of quiet importance. Those who controlled access to metal, or the knowledge to shape it, found themselves standing at the center of widening circles. In the lands that would one day be called the Balkans, miners descended into the dark. Shafts were carved into stone, torches trembled in narrow passages, baskets rose and fell, carrying ore from the depths. These were not the mines of later ages driven by empires, but humble wounds in the earth opened by patient hands. Yet even here the future stirred. Mining required cooperation. Smelting demanded fuel, planning, and time. Copper was no longer a curiosity picked from the soil. It had become a force that drew people together, organized labor, and reshaped how communities understood effort and reward. And in this growing complexity, a new idea quietly emerged, that some lives might shine more brightly than others. In Varna, near the dark mirror of the Black Sea, a man was laid to rest beneath the soil with nearly 1,000 objects of gold and copper. Axes that never cut wood. Ornaments that had never known labor. The earth closed over him, preserving the first clear echo of inequality. Metal had begun to mark not only tools, but status. The Copper Age was no longer only about shaping the world, it was beginning to shape people. While copper was quietly rearranging life in Europe, far beyond those forests and mountains, other worlds were awakening in their own rhythms. Between two ancient rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, water began to teach humanity how to stay. Here in the broad plains of Mesopotamia, people learned to guide floods instead of fleeing them. Channels were cut into the earth, ditches became veins, fields emerged where marsh once shimmered. Villages no longer wandered with the seasons, they rooted themselves. And in these rooted places, copper found a new purpose. In settlements like Eridu, time stacked itself in layers. Houses rose atop houses, generations built upon generations, mud brick walls thickened, temples grew taller. Within these sacred spaces, fire burned not only for warmth but for creation. Clay furnaces glowed, crucibles darkened, metal flowed in narrow streams like captured sunlight. Here, copper was no longer shaped in quiet homes. It was shaped under watchful eyes, guided by ritual, overseen by those who spoke for gods. The transformation of stone into metal became more than craft, it became sacred. The temple was no longer only a place of prayer, it became a heart of production, storage, and control. Grain was counted. Tools were distributed. Labor was organized. Copper axes, chisels, and ornaments emerged from workshops aligned with divine order. Every pore of molten metal echoed with meaning. To shape copper was to mirror creation itself, to take raw matter and breathe form into it. In this world, the glow of metal reflected not only firelight, but authority. Southward, along the long green ribbon of the Nile, a different rhythm unfolded. Desert winds carried sand across endless stone. Beyond the river's fertile banks, mountains hid veins of copper beneath their ancient skin. Egyptian communities began to send expeditions into these harsh lands. Men walked beneath merciless suns. Fires were built against cliffs. Water cracked heated stone. Ore was freed from the mountain's grip. These journeys were perilous, slow, and deliberate. They required planning, leadership, and faith. Copper, once gathered from the surface, now demanded endurance. Back along the river, metal reshaped possibility. Copper tools cut stone with greater patience than flint. Tombs deepened. Walls rose straighter. Architecture began to dream of permanence. Leaders emerged who could command not only people, but resources drawn from distant horizons. Weapons gleamed in ceremonial hands. Metal became both tool and symbol. It spoke of power, of reach, of divine favor. Across deserts and deltas, copper was teaching the same lesson in different tongues, that mastery of the earth could become mastery over others. Fire, once a companion beside the hearth, now burned in the service of structure, hierarchy, and vision. The Copper Age had grown beyond villages. It was shaping worlds. Across the wide plains of southeastern Europe, a strange new kind of settlement began to appear, places too large to be villages, yet born long before the idea of a city had a name. These communities did not rise in stone towers or walls, but in gentle rings of earth and timber, spreading outward like ripples in a still lake. They belonged to the people we now call the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, and in their time, they created some of the largest human settlements the world had ever known. From above, these places would have looked like vast spirals of life. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of houses formed concentric circles around open central spaces. Paths curved softly between dwellings. Smoke drifted upward in pale threads. Children ran along earthen lanes while dogs slept in patches of sunlight. Each home was built with care, wattle and clay walls, wooden frames, painted interiors, and hearths that glowed through the evening. These were not temporary shelters, they were expressions of belonging, of staying inside. Daily life unfolded with quiet rhythm. Grain was ground, cloth was woven. Pottery took form beneath patient hands, and in many homes fire burned for another purpose, the shaping of metal. Copper tools rested beside stone ones, molds lay near ovens. Here, metallurgy did not belong to distant temples or elite workshops, it lived among families. It shared space with meals, stories, and sleep. The scale of these settlements was astonishing. Some covered more land than many later medieval towns. Thousands of people lived together, not under kings, but through shared patterns of life. There were no palaces, no towering monuments. Only repetition, balance, and cooperation. Houses were rebuilt again and again in the same positions, generation after generation, as if the community itself remembered where each life belonged. Pottery from these settlements glowed with intricate spirals and flowing forms, painted in deep reds, blacks, and creams. The designs echoed movement, water, wind, growth. Each vessel was both tool and story. Copper objects moved through these homes quietly, used for work rather than display. Yet their presence marked something profound, that these vast communities were sustained not only by agriculture and kinship, but by craft, exchange, and shared knowledge. These were cities before cities, places where thousands learned to live side by side without walls of power. And in their gentle order, the Copper Age revealed another path, not of conquest or hierarchy, but of rhythm, pattern, and collective life beneath wide skies. As generations passed within these vast circular settlements, time itself seemed to move differently. Children grew into elders without ever leaving the gentle rings of their homes. Seasons turned like slow pages. Fields ripened, emptied, and ripened again. And all the while, fire continued its patient work, licking the bellies of clay ovens, softening copper, hardening pottery, warming hands in the dusk. Life here was not hurried. It unfolded like breath. The people of these great communities learned to shape not only metal but rhythm. Tasks were shared. Harvests were gathered together. Clay was dug from distant pits and carried home in baskets woven from reeds. Wood was cut and stacked for future winters. Copper ore, rarer and more precious, arrived through quiet trade from far-off hills, traveling from hand to hand like a secret passed gently along a chain of strangers who would never meet. Each fragment carried the memory of mountains, the echo of wind in places unseen. Within the homes, copper was shaped with care rather than spectacle. Small axes helped clear woodland, awls pierced leather, knives sliced grain, stalks, and plant fibers. These tools were not buried beneath gold or guarded by elites. They slept beside hearthstones, near children's toys and baskets of seeds. In this world, metal belonged to life itself, not to thrones, yet even here change moved silently beneath the surface. As settlements grew larger, not all homes were the same. Some contained more tools, finer pottery, better access to traded goods. Certain families became known for their skill with fire and metal. Their knowledge passed quietly from parent to child, wrapped in stories and careful demonstrations. Power did not yet wear crowns, but it began to gather in subtle ways, like mist collecting in low valleys. Then, in an act that still puzzles the present, these great communities sometimes chose to burn themselves. Houses were emptied, possessions carried away. Then flames were set deliberately, rising into the sky in vast, slow waves of smoke. Walls cracked, roofs collapsed inward. Entire neighborhoods became fields of ash and glowing embers. And afterward, the people moved on, building new rings elsewhere, leaving behind only blackened earth and the memory of warmth. Some believe these fires were rituals of renewal. Others think they marked endings brought by drought, tension, or exhaustion of the land. Perhaps they were both. A farewell and a beginning woven together in smoke. And so quietly, one of humanity's earliest experiments in immense shared living faded into the soil, leaving behind pottery shards, traces of copper, and the haunting knowledge that even the largest dreams can be gentle and temporary. While the great ringed settlements of Eastern Europe rose and faded like quiet breaths upon the land, another world was awakening along the edges of the Black Sea. Here, waves whispered against pale shores, and winds carried the scent of salt across open plains. Beneath this wide sky, the Varna culture flourished, its people standing at a crossroads between earth and water, between mountain and sea, between old ways and something entirely new. In this place, metal no longer lived only in hearths and hands. It entered ceremony. It entered memory. It entered the soil in ways that would echo across millennia. The cemetery at Varna lay beyond the daily rhythms of the living. Here, bodies were placed in careful silence, wrapped in meaning. Some graves held little more than pottery and bone. Others glowed. Gold sheets shimmered in the earth. Copper axes rested beside hands that would never lift them. Ornaments adorned forms that would never move. One grave in particular would one day astonish the future. Nearly 1,000 objects laid with a single man, weighing more than all the gold known from any earlier age combined. These were not tools for work, they were symbols. They spoke of distinction, of lineage, of a world where metal no longer measured only utility but identity. Nearby, in settlements along the coast and rivers, workshops hummed with quiet purpose, crucibles darkened with soot. Molds waited in the glow of embers. Craftsmen learned to melt copper, to pour it into shapes held in stone and clay. Hammering gave way to casting. Metal flowed like water, becoming axes, blades, and ornaments in a single breath of fire. The earth itself seemed to surrender more fully to human will. Gold joined copper in this dance. Unlike the working metal, gold did not tarnish, it did not corrode. It shimmered endlessly, reflecting light as if it carried a fragment of the sun. It had no edge, no weight of labor. It existed only to be seen, to be admired, to declare. And so, for the first time, humanity buried beauty for the sake of beauty. The dead carried light into darkness. Graves became messages written in metal, telling the living who had mattered and how deeply. The Copper Age had crossed a threshold. Metal was no longer just a companion to survival. It had become a language of power, a mirror of hierarchy, and a promise that some lives would echo longer than others. Beyond the glow of Varna's graves, the world continued to widen. Trade routes stretched like invisible threads across mountains and seas, binding distant communities into slow, patient networks of exchange. Copper from the Carpathians traveled south. Obsidian from volcanic islands drifted north. Shells from warm coasts appeared in cold valleys. Each object carried more than function. It carried story, distance, and connection. Along these paths, knowledge moved as quietly as goods. Techniques for casting, for annealing, for shaping metal with greater precision passed from hand to hand, village to village. Some communities became known for their molds, others for their alloys. In the Balkans, craftsmen learned to hollow axes, creating forms that looked solid yet weighed less, conserving precious metal while preserving the illusion of abundance. Even in beauty, efficiency learned to whisper. Settlements changed. Houses clustered around central spaces where fire burned not only for warmth, but for work. Copper workshops became gathering points. Children watched as molten light flowed into stone. Elders remembered earlier times when all tools were born from flint. The contrast between past and present grew sharper with every generation. Control over routes brought influence. Families who lived near mountain passes or river crossings became gatekeepers of movement. They accumulated not only objects, but trust, obligation, and reputation. Some mediated between worlds, others guarded secrets. Slowly, without crowns or banners, power learned to settle, conflict followed close behind. As copper became essential for tools and weapons, access to it became worth defending. Fortified settlements began to rise. Ditches deepened. Walls thickened. In places like the hilltops of the Balkans and the river valleys of Eastern Europe, communities ringed themselves with earth and timber. The world was still quiet, still largely bound by kinship and shared memory, but a new awareness stirred, the understanding that metal could decide who endured. Even so, life remained gentle in its rhythms. Fields were sown, looms whispered, children learned the shapes of stars. The Copper Age was not yet an age of armies. It was an age of thresholds, of first divisions, of first distinctions, of first dreams that stretched beyond the village horizon, and in every hearth fire continued its patient work. It softened stone, it shaped earth, it reflected in metal. And as flames flickered against clay walls, humanity slowly learned that the world could be changed, not all at once, not with thunder, but with quiet hands, glowing embers, and the courage to imagine something that had never been before. As Europe's copper-flamed horizons broadened, and its great ringed settlements faded into ash and memory, The ancient rivers of the East were preparing a different kind of future. In the lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates, water did not merely nourish, it commanded. Each year the rivers rose and fell, spreading silt across wide plains, leaving behind soil so fertile it seemed touched by divinity. Here, people learned not to wander with the seasons, but to anchor themselves within them. Villages clustered along banks where reeds whispered in warm winds and birds traced slow arcs through open skies. What began as scattered homes became enduring communities. Channels were cut into the earth, guiding water toward waiting fields. Each trench required cooperation. Each gate demanded trust. Irrigation bound neighbors together in ways stone walls never could. A field left dry did not only starve one family, it weakened all. In this landscape, copper found a new voice. No longer only the product of hearthside curiosity or regional craft, it became a foundation of organized life. Tools shaped canals. Axes cleared space for grain. Knives harvested fields that stretched farther than any memory. Workshops emerged near temples where fire burned with purpose beneath watchful eyes. Clay furnaces glowed in rhythm with ritual. Metal flowed under authority. The temple became more than a place of prayer. It became the heart of the settlement, a center of storage, distribution, and coordination. Grain moved through its rooms. Labor passed through its doors. Copper tools emerged from its shadow, marked by systems that had begun to resemble order. Craftsmen worked within structured spaces, their knowledge preserved and supervised. Fire was no longer wild, it was governed. Cities did not rise overnight. They layered themselves slowly like sediment at a river's edge, house upon house, generation upon generation. Eridu, Uruk, and became names etched into time, each built atop countless forgotten foundations. Streets formed, courtyards widened. Roofs sheltered entire lifetimes. Here, permanence was no longer a dream, it was an expectation. In these places, copper was no longer rare, it was necessary, it was counted, it was allocated. Metal tools passed from temple hands into fields and workshops. Each object became part of a system, one that measured labor, reward, and belonging. The glow of molten copper reflected not only firelight but intention. And so, beside rivers older than memory, humanity learned a new art, not only how to shape the earth, but how to remain upon it. The Copper Age, once scattered across hills and hearths, had begun to gather itself into something enduring. Life within these river-borne settlements unfolded like a slow, continuous breath. Morning light spilled across mud-brick walls. Water shimmered in canals. Farmers stepped into fields softened by silt, their copper tools glinting briefly before vanishing into grain. Children carried jars from wells. Weavers worked in shade. Potters shaped vessels that would carry food, water, and memory. And always, somewhere nearby, fire burned for transformation. In the workshops that nestled against temple walls, craftsmen learned to speak fluently with flame. Bellows breathed into furnaces, charcoal cracked and glowed, copper softened, then flowed. Molds waited in patient silence. Each pour required precision, timing, trust. Too cool and the metal stiffened. Too hot and it rebelled. Knowledge was no longer accidental. It was taught. Preserved, guarded, metal tools emerged in forms that felt deliberate, axes balanced for clearing land, chisels shaped for wood and stone, blades refined for harvest. These objects did more than serve. They standardized, they unified. A canal built with copper tools followed straighter lines. A wall cut with metal endured longer. The land itself began to mirror the order of those who shaped it. Above these rhythms, the temple rose as both symbol and anchor. Within its walls, priests and administrators counted grain, assigned labor, and oversaw production. Clay tokens tracked resources, seals marked ownership. Even before writing, memory became external, pressed into wet earth hardened by fire. Copper ingots bore impressions, vessels carried marks. Identity and order fused with material. To work metal in this world was to stand at the intersection of craft and power. Master craftsmen held status not through lineage, but through mastery. Their hands shaped objects that sustained cities. Their knowledge traveled through structured apprenticeships, binding families to function. Fire was no longer merely warmth. It was governance in glow. Outside, rivers continued their endless cycles. Flood, retreat, renewal. Fields ripened. Harvests filled granaries. Life stabilized. Unlike the great European settlements that had burned and moved, these communities layered themselves deeper into the earth. They stayed. The Copper Age here did not wander. It rooted. It thickened. It began quietly to resemble civilization. While the river cities of Mesopotamia learned to stay, to build upward and inward, the land to the west became a bridge between worlds. Anatolia, wide, mountainous, threaded with valleys and coastlines, stood between Europe and the Near East like an open hand. Through its passes flowed obsidian, copper, grain, ideas, and people. Here the Copper Age learned to travel. Settlements rose along ridges and shorelines, watching over narrow straits and river mouths. Among them stood Troy, perched above the waters that joined two seas. From this height, its people could see ships pass, their sails pale against the blue. Each vessel carried more than cargo, it carried possibility. Troy grew not through conquest, but through connection. Stone walls rose, thick and patient. Homes gained multiple rooms, storage jars lined cool floors. Workshops filled with the scent of smoke and metal, Anatolian craftsmen blended traditions. From the east came casting techniques. From the west, hammering and surface work. Copper axes took on new forms. Pins became ornaments. Vessels learned curves shaped by distant hands. Metal from many mountains met in a single hearth. Each alloy told a story of movement. Trade across water transformed scale. Ships followed coastlines guided by stars and headlands. Harbors formed. Quays reached into tides. Copper traveled farther than ever before, not in handfuls but in loads. With it came ideas about weight, balance, and measure. Stone weights appeared, shaped with care. Exchange learned consistency. Trust became system. Communities that guarded narrow passages grew powerful. They did not rule by armies but by access. Whoever controlled the gate controlled the flow. Wealth gathered in storerooms. Influence gathered in families. Authority began to take shape, not as king or empire but as central presence. Anatolia became a living corridor. Through it passed Europe's copper dreams and Mesopotamia's ordered flame. The Copper Age no longer belonged to valleys alone. It spanned seas, and the world grew smaller. As Anatolia learned to stand between horizons, other lands awakened along their own rivers. To the south, where desert met water, the Nile unfurled its green ribbon through a world of stone and sun. Each year it rose, gentle and predictable, leaving behind dark soil that glimmered with promise. Here life did not struggle against the land, it moved in rhythm with it. Villages gathered along the river's edge, reeds whispered in warm winds, boats drifted quietly between banks. And in this steady world, copper began to reshape ambition. The earliest Egyptian metalworkers did not remain near home. They crossed deserts. They followed dry wadis into mountains where the earth hid veins of green and blue. Fires were built against bare rock. Water cracked stone. Ore was pried loose and carried back across miles of sand. These journeys required planning, coordination, and trust. They forged something new long before a blade ever did. Organization. Back along the Nile, copper tools transformed labor. Stone that once resisted now yielded. Tombs deepened. Walls straightened. Wooden beams were shaped with greater precision. Architecture began to dream of permanence. Leaders who could command metal could command time. With each generation, the tools of stone gave way to the tools of fire. The future grew heavier, more deliberate. Metal entered ceremony. Mace heads gleamed in ritual hands. Axes became symbols as much as instruments. Copper did not merely serve, it spoke. It declared authority, it reflected divine order. Those who controlled its flow gained more than utility. They gained legitimacy. The Copper Age in Egypt did not sprawl. It aligned. It gathered around the river's rhythm and prepared for unity. From scattered communities emerged regional centers. From rivalry grew consolidation. And in the quiet glow of copper, the foundations of a kingdom were laid. Here, metal did not wander. It prepared a throne. And as desert winds swept across stone and water flowed endlessly northward, the Age of Fire taught a river-bound people how to become eternal. Far to the east of the Nile, and beyond the mountain corridors of Anatolia, another river system was shaping a world in its own quiet way. The Indus flowed through broad plains, carrying snowmelt from distant peaks into lands that shimmered beneath wide skies. Here, communities gathered along fertile banks, planting grain, raising cattle, and building homes that faced the sun. Unlike the rising hierarchies of Egypt or the temple-centered order of Mesopotamia, these people imagined harmony first. Settlements like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro did not grow by accident. They were planned. Streets crossed at right angles, neighborhoods formed around wells. Houses opened inward to private courtyards where light pooled gently on clay floors. Each brick was shaped to the same proportions, fired to the same strength, stacked in the same rhythm. The city itself became a pattern, as calm and deliberate as breath. Beneath these streets ran covered drains, carrying waste away in silence. Water flowed where it was meant to flow. Dirt was guided away from living spaces. Health was not a privilege, it was built into the ground. Every home, whether large or modest, connected to this hidden network. The city cared for its people not through monuments, but through balance. Within this order, copper found its place. Workshops clustered near the edges of neighborhoods, close enough to serve daily life, distant enough to keep fire from homes. Furnaces glowed behind brick walls, molds lay in neat rows. Tools emerged in consistent forms, axes, chisels, knives, nearly identical across cities separated by hundreds of miles. Craft here was not expression, it was standard. Metalworkers in the Indus world mastered alloy, copper blended with tin to become bronze. Each proportion was chosen with care. Agricultural tools remained flexible, weapons hardened. This was not experiment, it was system. Knowledge moved through training, not chance. Quality repeated itself, trade fed these workshops. Copper traveled from distant hills. Tin arrived from far mountains. Lapis lazuli glowed blue from lands beyond sight. Weights of stone, polished and precise, measured every exchange. The smallest could balance a grain of gold. The largest could anchor bulk grain. Each weight followed a sequence that never varied. Trust became mathematical. Yet in all this order, something remarkable remained absent. No palaces rose above the streets. No towering temples cast shadows across homes. No royal tombs claimed space. Authority here did not shout. It organized. The Copper Age in the Indus Valley did not build kings. It built cities that breathed. Life within these river cities unfolded with a quiet confidence. Morning light slipped through lattice windows and settled into inner courtyards where families gathered around clay hearths. Water was drawn from private wells. Waste flowed away unseen. The city itself seemed to breathe, its systems guiding daily life without command or spectacle. Children learned the grid of streets as naturally as they learned their own names. Craftsmen opened wooden doors to workshops that had stood for generations. The rhythm of work was steady, unhurried, and precise. In the metalworking quarters, fire burned with disciplined calm. Furnaces were fed with charcoal brought from distant forests. Bellows whispered, copper softened, bronze formed. Molds shaped blades that matched others made hundreds of miles away. A chisel born in Harappa could rest beside one from Mohenjo-Daro and appear as if made by the same hand. Such consistency did not arise by accident. It reflected an invisible agreement shared across the civilization, a promise that things would be made the right way, every time. Seals carved from stone appeared on storage jars and bundles of goods. Each bore animals, symbols, and signs whose meanings remain hidden to the present. They marked ownership, quality, origin. They traveled with copper ingots, with beads, with tools. Trade did not depend on voice alone. It relied on trust embedded in clay and stone. Across deserts and rivers, merchants recognized these marks. The city spoke even when no one stood beside it. Ports along the coast welcomed ships that rose and fell with tides. At places like Lothal, docks of brick reached into the sea. Warehouses filled with metal, grain, and cloth. Vessels departed toward distant shores. Harappan seals would one day be found in Mesopotamian cities, resting among foreign stones. Copper and bronze from the Indus traveled far, not as conquest, but as connection. Yet even in this vast network, no ruler claimed the sky, no palace crowned the streets. Wealth did not gather into monuments. It flowed, it circulated. Homes varied in size, but none dwarfed the rest. Authority remained subtle, embedded in systems rather than faces. The Copper Age here did not elevate one voice above all others. It taught a civilization to move as one body, measured, balanced, enduring. And in that harmony, metal became not a symbol of power, but a quiet promise that the world could be ordered without fear. While the cities of the Indus perfected balance and quiet order, far to the west another transformation was stirring across Europe. Here the Copper Age did not build grids or canals. It moved, it wandered, it flowed with people who carried their homes in memory and their identities in objects. Around 2800 BC, a new pattern appeared across the continent as if woven by invisible hands. Bell-shaped vessels began to surface in graves from Iberia to the British Isles, from river valleys to distant coasts. With them came copper daggers, stone wrist guards, and ornaments that seemed to speak a shared language across immense distances. These were not the products of a single empire. No banners marked their spread. Instead, they arrived with people, travelers, families, craftsmen, warriors, who carried traditions with them. The bell beaker culture, as it would later be called, did not replace older ways overnight. It layered itself upon them, blending with local customs while preserving its distinct shape. A vessel made in Spain resembled one in England. A dagger buried in Germany echoed one in Italy. Across thousands of miles, a shared identity whispered through clay and copper. Metalwork within these communities reached new refinement. Copper daggers were cast with care, their edges hammered sharp, their tangs shaped for secure hafting. These were not simple tools, they were personal. They rested against the body, they traveled with their owners. They marked adulthood, status, readiness. Stone wrist guards protected archers' arms and gleamed softly in burial light. Together, these objects formed a language of belonging. The movement of bell beaker people reshaped Europe's social map. Settlements became more mobile. Connections spanned valleys and seas. Marriage carried culture across borders. Knowledge leapt where trade alone could not reach. Copper technology, once regional, became continental. A craftsman in the Alps could recognize the form of a blade from the Atlantic coast. The Copper Age had learned to speak across distance. In graves, these travelers rested with their tools and vessels, wrapped in traditions that bound them to unseen kin. Identity was no longer anchored solely to land. It traveled, it adapted, it spread like fire carried from hearth to hearth. The Copper Age here did not settle. It journeyed. Alongside these wandering bell beaker communities, another current flowed across the heart of Europe. The corded, where culture spread from the wide plains of the east toward forests and river valleys, carrying with it a different rhythm, a different memory of home. Their pottery bore the impressions of twisted cords pressed into soft clay, leaving behind patterns that looked like frozen motion. Each vessel was both tool and signature, a mark of belonging that could be recognized across enormous distances. These people moved with animals, wagons, and families. They followed rivers and open lands, settling briefly, then moving again. Their world was one of motion and horizon. And within this movement, copper took on new form. Metalworkers learned to cast shaft-hole axes, tools that required complex molds and precise control. A wooden handle passed through the body of the blade itself, creating a weapon and tool far stronger than anything made before. These axes were not casual objects, they were statements of capability, of authority, of readiness. Copper ore traveled from mountain sources through chains of exchange that spanned entire regions. From the Carpathians, metal flowed west and north. Finished axes moved in return. Chemical traces preserved within their blades still speak of these journeys, revealing paths that crossed cultures and landscapes. A tool made from eastern copper might rest in a grave hundreds of miles away, carried by hands that never saw its source. Where bell beaker and corded, where worlds met, traditions blended. Graves appeared containing both cord-impressed pottery and bell-shaped vessels. Daggers lay beside shaft-hole axes. Cultures did not collide, they intertwined. Marriage, trade, and shared movement wove a network that spanned the continent. Europe became a living fabric of roots and relationships. With metal came new forms of conflict. Access to copper meant access to power. Hilltops gained walls, ditches deepened, communities learned to defend. Warrior identities emerged, not as standing armies, but as individuals whose status came from skill and possession. A man buried with dagger, wrist guard, and bow was more than a hunter. He was a protector, a challenger, a symbol. The Copper Age in Europe no longer whispered only of craft. It spoke of movement, encounter, and tension. Metal traveled with people, and people carried change. Across forests and fields, beneath skies that stretched endlessly, the continent learned to wander. High in the frozen silence of the Alps, long after the great ringed cities had turned to ash, and the river kingdoms had learned to endure, a single man climbed through snow with a copper blade at his side. The mountains were vast and indifferent, their peaks cutting into pale skies, their passes shaped by wind and time. He moved carefully, wrapped in hide and grass, carrying a bow not yet finished and arrows that told of recent struggle. His name has vanished, but his body remained, sealed in ice for more than 5,000 years. We know him now as Ötzi. His copper axe was unlike anything the world had known before. Cast with care, hardened with trace elements that strengthened its edge, it was bound to a wooden handle with birch tar and sinew. This was not a crude tool. It was the product of many hands, many skills, many journeys. The copper within it had traveled from distant mountains, crossing valleys and cultures before resting in his grip. Every strike he might have made with it carried the memory of fire, earth, and trade. An arrow struck him from behind. It pierced flesh, severed vessels, and ended a life beneath the open sky. His body fell among stones and snow, and there it remained, untouched by decay, waiting for a future that would not yet understand him. In his wounds lay the truth of the Copper Age. Metal had not only built, it had armed. It had given advantage. It had taught humans how to kill at distance and with certainty. Ötzi's final moments echo across the millennia. He was not a king, not a priest, not a legend in his time. He was a traveler in a world reshaped by copper. His life carried the marks of craft, trade, and conflict. His death revealed the cost of a world where power could be carried in a hand. Through him, the Copper Age speaks plainly. Fire gave humanity tools, tools gave humanity reach, and reach, once learned, could not be forgotten. The dream of metal had become real. Ötzi was not alone in carrying the weight of a changing world. Across Europe, thousands like him moved through forests, valleys, and passes, bearing copper blades, stone-tipped arrows, and the quiet awareness that the balance between people had shifted. Metal no longer belonged only to hearths and workshops. It traveled on belts. It slept beside warriors. It crossed borders in the hands of those who could defend it. Hilltops became refuges. Communities raised earth and timber into ramparts. Ditches carved deep rings around homes. The land itself began to reflect caution. Where once paths were open and shared, now they were watched. Where once strangers brought news, now they brought uncertainty. Copper weapons did not make violence inevitable, but they made it decisive. A broken stone blade ended a fight. A metal edge ended a life, yet even in this rising tension, life remained tender. Fields were still sown, children still learned songs, fires still warmed winter nights. The Copper Age did not become a world of endless war, it became a world of awareness. People learned that some objects could tilt fate, that skill could outweigh number. That distance could no longer guarantee safety. In graves from this era, bodies rest with complete warrior sets, dagger, wrist guard, bow. These were not kings. They were individuals whose identity centered on readiness. Their presence marks the birth of a new social figure, the warrior not as myth but as role. Status no longer came only from age or lineage. It could be earned through capability. Trade routes grew more guarded. Alliances formed between distant groups. Marriage became diplomacy. Metal linked communities even as it sharpened their boundaries. The Copper Age revealed a truth humanity would never unlearn. Technology reshapes not only tools but trust. Ötzi's frozen form reminds us that this transformation was not abstract. It unfolded in breath and blood, in footsteps and fear. The world he walked was still beautiful, alpine skies, silent snow, ancient stone. But beneath that beauty flowed a new current. Fire had given humans more than warmth. It had given them choice, and choice, once kindled, could not be cooled. As copper reshaped lives across Europe's mountains and valleys, the land itself began to answer. Forests thinned where charcoal was burned for furnaces. Hills bore scars where ore was pulled from stone. Rivers carried traces of human ambition downstream. The Copper Age did not only change people, it changed the face of the world. Every blade, every axe, every ornament required fuel. Wood became heat. Heat became metal. Entire hillsides were cleared to feed fires that glowed through the night. Smoke rose from settlements like breath from sleeping giants. In places rich with ore, the earth hollowed. Shafts descended deeper. Supports of timber held back collapse. Men learned to trust beams of wood against the weight of mountains. This labor demanded coordination. Mining was no longer the work of individuals. It became collective. Teams descended. Others hauled. Some crushed ore. Others tended flame. Copper production taught societies how to organize effort across time. A blade was no longer made in an evening. It required days of preparation, seasons of supply, and networks of cooperation. The land remembered these changes. Deforested slopes eroded, streams shifted, settlements migrated as resources waned. Some communities flourished where new veins were found, others faded where hills fell silent. The Copper Age introduced humanity to a new truth, that the earth itself could be exhausted, yet in this realization lay growth. People began to understand cycles not only of harvest, but of resource. They learned to move when the land grew tired. They learned to trade when local veins emptied. They learned that survival now depended on more than weather, it depended on management. Copper linked humanity not only to each other, but to the limits of the world. It whispered that every gift had a cost, every flame consumed something ancient. Every tool carried a fragment of the mountain's life. And so, as fire burned brighter in human hands, a new relationship formed, one between civilization and the earth itself. The Copper Age taught humanity how to change the world. It also taught humanity that change leaves a mark. Across continents, the Copper Age drew toward a quiet turning point. The lessons learned beside hearths and rivers, in mountains and deserts, in cities and wandering camps, had woven themselves into the fabric of human life. Fire was no longer merely a companion, it was a teacher. Stone was no longer destiny, it was a beginning. Humanity had learned to bend the earth, to coax it into new forms, to imagine futures that did not yet exist. Yet copper carried a limit within its glow. It was softer than iron would be. It dulled. It bent beneath heavy blows. It demanded care. And in this fragility lay the seed of what would come next. Craftsmen across many lands noticed that certain stones, when smelted with copper, hardened it. Arsenic whispered through the melt. Tin followed. By accident and experiment, a new metal began to appear, stronger, sharper, more enduring. Bronze waited in the wings of history, patient as ore in shadow. Communities sensed change before they named it. Tools improved, weapons held their edge, boundaries shifted again. The rhythms of life, once anchored in stone, then softened by copper, now prepared to be reshaped once more. The world felt heavier, more deliberate. Time itself seemed to gather momentum, but the Copper Age did not vanish. It settled into memory, into patterns of trade, into the first cities, into the idea that humanity could reinvent itself. It left behind canals and routes, graves of gold and villages of ash, axes in ice and seals in clay. It taught humans that knowledge could travel farther than feet, that fire could turn earth into destiny, that the world was not fixed. As the embers of this age dim, they do not go dark. They become coals beneath the next flame, and now, as your own night deepens, you may let these ancient fires fade into rest. The valleys grow quiet, the rivers slow, the mountains release their breath. History, having spoken, grows gentle again. Sleep carries you where time first learned to bend. Long after copper had taught humanity how to bend stone and shape fire, the world itself seemed to lean forward, as if listening for what might come next. Across the eastern Mediterranean, coastlines shimmered beneath warm skies, and rivers traced silver paths through fertile lands. The age of wandering and first cities had passed into memory, yet its lessons remained alive in every tool, every hearth, every road worn into the earth. In Egypt, the Nile continued its eternal rhythm. Each year it rose, gentle and patient, laying dark silt across waiting fields. Villages clustered along its banks, their lives woven into the pulse of flood and retreat. But now copper tools rested in calloused hands, stone gave way more easily, wood yielded, walls rose straighter, tombs sank deeper into the earth, the world grew more permanent with every season. The people no longer thought only of survival, they thought of continuity, of legacy, of names that would outlast breath. Metal, once a curiosity, became a promise. A chisel could carve stone that would endure for generations. An axe could clear land that would feed children yet unborn. Copper whispered of time beyond a single life. In the workshops near temples, fire burned with practiced calm. Bellows breathed, furnaces glowed, craftsmen poured molten light into molds shaped by tradition. Each object emerged with intention. Nothing was accidental. The process itself became sacred. To shape metal was to mirror creation, to draw form from chaos. Rulers began to rise, not yet as pharaohs crowned in gold, but as leaders whose authority flowed from organization and control. They commanded labor. They directed expeditions into deserts and mountains. They oversaw the movement of copper from distant veins into the heart of the valley. With each expedition, Egypt learned to reach beyond itself. In this world, metal was no longer simply a tool, it was a bridge between earth and eternity. It bound people to place, labor to purpose, life to afterlife. The Copper Age here did not fade, it transformed into something enduring. The river flowed on. Fire glowed steadily, and a civilization prepared to carve itself into time. Beyond the green ribbon of the Nile, the desert stretched in waves of stone and sand, silent beneath an unbroken sky. To earlier generations, these lands had been boundaries, places to avoid, to fear, to skirt along the edges of life. But now, guided by copper's promise, people began to cross them with purpose. Expeditions formed, carrying water skins, food stores, stone hammers, and the quiet certainty that something precious waited beyond the horizon. In the eastern desert and the Sinai Peninsula, mountains hid veins of green and blue beneath their ancient skin. Fires were built against bare rock. The stone was heated until it cracked, then struck while still warm. Each fracture released fragments of ore, glittering faintly in the sun. Men worked in rhythm, passing baskets from hand to hand, breathing dust that shimmered in torchlight. Temporary camps rose in places no one had ever called home, their hearths glowing briefly against the vastness. These journeys demanded more than strength. They required planning, leadership, and trust. Food had to be measured, water rationed, routes remembered, guards watched for threats in empty lands. Copper mining became one of humanity's first large-scale logistical endeavors. It taught people how to organize time, labor, and distance long before writing would give such efforts a permanent voice. Back along the river, the effects were visible. Workshops filled with tools of increasing precision. Copper chisels cut stone more cleanly than flint ever could. Wooden beams were shaped with new confidence. Tombs deepened. Walls grew straighter. Architecture began to dream beyond a single generation. With each object shaped in fire, Egypt learned that effort could be preserved, that labor could become legacy. Metal entered ritual as naturally as it entered work. Mace heads gleamed in ceremonies. Blades rested beside the dead. Copper became both companion and symbol, binding daily life to sacred meaning. To hold metal was to hold permanence in a world once governed only by seasons. Through these desert paths and glowing furnaces, the Copper Age taught Egypt how to endure. The river still flowed. The sun still rose. But now, humanity had learned to leave marks that would not wash away. As Egypt learned to reach into desert stone and return with the bones of mountains, power began to gather along the river's curve. Villages grew into centers. Centers became regions. Regions leaned toward unity. Copper did not create this movement, but it carried it forward, giving leaders tools that could shape both land and loyalty. A ruler who could command metal could command walls, tools, weapons, and monuments. In a world where stone had once resisted every dream, copper taught ambition how to endure. The earliest great tombs rose from this understanding. Mud and stone were no longer enough. The dead deserved permanence. Chambers were carved deeper, passages aligned more carefully. Copper chisels sang against limestone. Each strike echoed with purpose. These were not merely graves. They were promises that memory itself could be built. Work gangs formed, organized by season and task. Some quarried stone, others hauled blocks, others shaped wood and metal. Food was stored, tools were distributed. Authority became administrative long before it became divine. The Copper Age had taught people that scale required structure. Within temple precincts, workshops multiplied. Molds grew more complex. Alloys became more deliberate. Craftsmen learned how small changes in heat or composition altered strength. Copper blended with arsenic and early tin, producing blades that held their edge longer, struck harder, and resisted wear. These proto-bronzes hinted at what was coming. Even as copper still ruled the age, metal's symbolic power deepened. Weapons appeared in regalia. Tools rested beside gods. To govern was to command fire. To rule was to shape the earth itself. The transformation of ore into object mirrored the transformation of people into subjects. In this world, leadership no longer rested only on lineage or age. It rested on coordination, on vision, on the ability to move people and material through space and time. Copper became the bloodstream of emerging statehood, and as these structures took form, the Nile carried them forward, season by season, embedding fire's lessons into the bones of civilization. The final gift of the Copper Age to Egypt was not a tool, nor a weapon, nor even a monument. It was a way of thinking in layers of time. Stone could now be cut with patience. Metal could be shaped with intention. Labor could be organized across seasons. The world was no longer a place to endure, it was a place to design. Along the river, communities began to imagine futures measured not in harvests but in generations. A tomb might take years, a temple might take lifetimes, yet copper made such dreams possible. Each chisel mark in limestone was a declaration that memory mattered. Each beam set into place was an act of faith in tomorrow. The skills developed for mining and metallurgy flowed into every other craft. Furnace design informed kiln construction, bellows taught airflow. Precision learned in metalwork reshaped pottery, carpentry, and stone carving. Technology no longer advanced in isolation, it echoed across disciplines. The Copper Age had created a web of knowledge, where progress in one craft lifted all others, even the rhythm of society changed. Time was divided into projects, into phases, into coordinated effort. Workers gathered when the river fell, dispersed when fields demanded attention, returned again when stone awaited shaping. The land and the state learned to move together. By the end of this age, Egypt stood at a threshold. Copper still glowed in workshops, yet new metals whispered from crucibles. Harder edges emerged, stronger forms took shape. The future was no longer imagined, it was being forged. The Copper Age had taught humanity how to bend the world. Egypt would teach the world how to remember. And as the Nile flowed beneath starlight, carrying reflections of fire and stone, the ancient dream of metal prepared to become something greater still. Far from the deserts of Egypt and the wandering valleys of Europe, the rivers of the East continued their patient work. Beyond the mountains where snow never fully melted, water flowed southward into broad plains, carrying silt, memory, and life. Along these banks, the Indus civilization endured, quiet, ordered, and unlike any other world the Copper Age had shaped. Here, the age of metal did not roar, it whispered. Harappan cities did not rise in monuments, they unfolded in patterns. Streets crossed in calm geometry. Homes turned inward, opening onto courtyards where sunlight pooled and shadows cooled. Every brick followed the same proportions. Every drain led gently away from human space. Even the smallest dwelling shared in the same infrastructure as the largest. The city itself became a living organism, balanced, breathing, aware. Copper moved through this world without spectacle. Workshops glowed softly near the edges of neighborhoods. Furnaces warmed in measured cycles. Molds rested in neat order. Tools emerged in forms so consistent that a blade born in one city could rest beside another from hundreds of miles away and appear as if made by the same hand. This was not imitation. It was coordination. Metalworkers understood alloy as a language. Copper blended with tin became bronze. Each proportion served a purpose. Agricultural tools remained flexible, cutting edges hardened. Weapons gained endurance. Knowledge passed through training, not chance. Every craftsman learned the same rhythms of heat, breath, and pour. Trade nourished this system. Copper traveled from distant hills. Tin crossed deserts and rivers. Lapis lazuli shimmered blue from far mountains. Stone weights, polished and precise, balanced each exchange. Every merchant spoke the same numerical language. Trust became structure. Yet in all this sophistication, something remained absent. No palace cast a shadow over the streets. No royal tomb claimed the skyline. Authority here did not stand above. It moved through systems. The city itself governed. The Copper Age in the Indus world did not crown kings. It taught thousands to live as one. Life within these cities unfolded with a calm that feels almost modern. At dawn, light slipped across brick walls and gathered in courtyards where families prepared simple meals. Water rose from private wells. Waste vanished into covered drains beneath the streets. The city worked quietly in the background, guiding daily life without command or spectacle. Children learned the grid of streets as naturally as they learned their own names. Craftsmen opened wooden doors to workshops that had stood for generations. The rhythm of the city was steady, unhurried, precise. In the metalworking quarters, fire burned with disciplined patience. Furnaces were fed with charcoal hauled from distant forests. Bellows whispered, copper softened. Bronze formed, molds shaped tools that matched others made hundreds of miles away. An axe born in Harappa could rest beside one from Mohenjo-Daro, and appear as if cast by the same hand. Such consistency did not arise from chance. It reflected an invisible agreement shared across the civilization, a promise that things would be made the right way, every time. Seals carved from stone appeared on jars, bundles, and ingots. Each bore animals, symbols, and signs whose meanings remain hidden to us. They marked ownership, origin, and trust. These seals traveled with copper beads and cloth. Trade no longer depended on voice alone. It relied on marks pressed into clay and hardened by fire. Across deserts and rivers, merchants recognized these impressions. The city spoke even when no one stood beside it. Along the coast, ports welcomed ships that rose and fell with the tide. At Lothal, brick docks reached into the sea, cradling vessels that carried goods far beyond the horizon. Warehouses filled with copper ingots, bronze tools, grain, and cloth. From here, Harappan objects would journey westward, eventually resting in Mesopotamian cities, silent witnesses to a world that had learned to connect without conquest. Yet for all this reach, no ruler stood above the streets, no palace towered over homes, wealth did not harden into monuments. It flowed, it circulated. Houses varied in size, but none dwarfed the rest. Authority remained subtle, embedded in systems rather than faces. The Copper Age in the Indus Valley did not proclaim power. It practiced balance. It taught a civilization to endure without fear. Beyond the ordered streets and silent drains of the Indus cities, the land itself began to shift. Rivers that had once followed steady paths wandered, channels filled with silt, fields that had known reliable water grew uncertain, monsoon rhythms altered their breath. The world, so carefully balanced by human hands, reminded its builders that even the most harmonious designs must answer to forces older than memory. Communities responded with the same calm intelligence that had shaped their cities. Reservoirs were carved into stone, channels were redirected. New settlements rose where water still listened. Yet over generations, the quiet certainty that had sustained this civilization began to thin. Trade routes lengthened, distances grew harder to bridge, workshops still glowed but their rhythm softened. The precise sameness that had once defined tools and bricks began to blur. Copper and bronze objects from this later time reveal subtle changes. Blades grow less uniform, alloys vary, weights lose perfect balance. It is not collapse that speaks through these artifacts, but strain. Systems that had required constant coordination stretched across widening gaps. The web of trust thinned. What had once been effortless now demanded renewal. Unlike cities of stone that fall in fire and ruin, the Indus world faded like a tide. Homes were abandoned gently, streets emptied. Drains fell silent. People moved not in panic but in search of steadier ground. They carried their knowledge with them, the memory of order, of sanitation, of standard and seal. But the great urban heart slowed. The Copper Age here did not end in conquest. It ended in migration, in adaptation. In the quiet understanding that balance must sometimes be found anew. And so, the cities that had taught the world how to live together released their people back into the wider land, leaving behind bricks, tools, and the echo of a dream. That humanity could build a world where no one stood above another, and metal served harmony rather than dominion. As the Indus cities loosened their hold on the land, their legacy did not vanish. It dispersed, carried in habits, in memory, in the quiet expectations people held about how a community should feel. Wells would still be dug, streets would still be imagined in lines. Weights would still be balanced in the hand before a trade. The Copper Age had taught these people not merely how to shape metal, but how to shape coexistence. Even as brick walls crumbled back into soil, the idea of order endured. Across the wider world, echoes of this age overlapped and intertwined. In Europe, movement and tension continued to define life. In Egypt, permanence hardened into stone. In Mesopotamia, canals deepened and cities layered themselves toward writing. Everywhere, copper had prepared humanity for scale. It had taught people to coordinate, to plan beyond the season, to think in generations. It had revealed that the earth could be persuaded, that fire could be trusted, and that knowledge could travel farther than any single body. Yet copper also carried its own ending. Softer than the metals waiting beyond the horizon, it demanded care, it bent, it dulled, it reminded its users that progress is never final. In workshops from the Nile to the Danube, craftsmen noticed that certain mixtures hardened the blade. Arsenic shimmered in the melt, tin whispered of strength. By experiment and accident, a new substance emerged, one that held its edge longer, struck truer, endured. Bronze waited, patient as ore in shadow. The Copper Age did not resist what followed, it invited it. Every furnace, every mold, every trade route, every system of labor and trust had prepared the way. Humanity had learned to live with fire. The next age would ask it to live with power, and so, as this chapter of the world's long story softens into memory, its embers remain. They glow beneath the surface of every city, every tool, every road that follows a river or a pass. They remind us that before empires, before writing, before kings, there was a quiet moment beside a hearth when a stone bent instead of breaking. The first metal dream does not end. It becomes the world. Across the wide plains and dark forests of Europe, the world began to feel restless. The old boundaries between valley and hill, between river and coast, softened beneath the movement of people. Paths that had once served traders now carried families. Horizons widened. Camps became temporary. Home became something carried in memory rather than anchored in soil. The Copper Age had taught humanity how to move not only goods, but identity itself. In this wandering world, metal became companion and compass. A copper dagger at the belt was more than protection, it was belonging. A wrist guard on the arm marked one as part of a shared story stretching beyond any single valley. Pottery forms repeated across immense distances, whispering of unseen kin. A traveler could recognize a stranger by the curve of a vessel, the shape of a blade, the way a cord impression caught the light. These communities lived between places. Wagons creaked across open land. Herds followed grass and water. Rivers became highways. Mountains became thresholds. With each step, knowledge traveled: how to cast, how to harden, how to trade, how to survive among those who spoke different tongues but held familiar tools. Copper reshaped social gravity. Leadership no longer rested only with elders who remembered a single place. It began to gather around those who could navigate distance, who knew routes, who held relationships across regions. A person who could guide a group through unknown lands carried influence. A craftsman whose blades were trusted carried authority. Power learned to walk. In this mobile world, alliances mattered more than walls. Marriage joined distant groups, shared ritual bridged valleys, objects became promises, a dagger given was a bond, a vessel exchanged was trust. Metal, once shaped in quiet homes, now stitched cultures together across vast space. The Copper Age in Europe did not settle into stone. It learned to move. It learned that identity could travel farther than feet. Movement brought wonder, but it also brought strain. As paths crossed and territories overlapped, the quiet certainty of earlier ages gave way to vigilance. Valleys that had once known only neighbors now felt the presence of strangers. River crossings became places of negotiation. Hilltops became places of watchfulness. Copper, which had once promised connection, now carried the weight of defense. Communities learned to read the land with new eyes. Elevated ground offered safety, narrow passes offered control. Earth was piled into ramparts, timber rose into palisades. The first hill forts emerged not as cities but as shelters against uncertainty. Within their rings, families gathered with livestock and tools, waiting for danger to pass. Fire burned lower, voices softened. The world outside felt wider and less certain. With copper weapons came a new awareness of consequence. A stone blade might fail, a copper edge endured. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. An arrow tipped with metal could end a life before a face was seen. This did not turn the world into endless war, but it changed the shape of fear. It taught communities to prepare. It taught individuals that skill could outweigh number. Graves from this era speak in quiet clarity. Some hold only pottery and bone. Others cradle daggers, wrist guards, bows, and arrows. These were not kings. They were people whose lives had revolved around readiness. Their identity rested not in land or lineage, but in capability. The warrior was no longer a figure of myth, he had become a role. Yet even amid tension, life remained tender. Fields were still planted, children still learned the names of stars, songs still rose around evening fires. The Copper Age did not erase gentleness, it layered it with awareness. The world was still beautiful, forests breathing, rivers shining, skies vast. But beneath that beauty flowed a new understanding, that the future could arrive from beyond the horizon. Metal had taught humanity to move. it had also taught humanity to watch. As Europe learned to live between motion and vigilance, the land itself began to change under human hands. Forests thinned where charcoal was burned for furnaces. Hillsides bore the scars of shallow mines. Valleys echoed with the rhythm of hammer and fire. Copper had become a companion to daily life, and its hunger reshaped the world that fed it. Every blade required wood turn to heat. Every axe carried the memory of a tree. The earth, once infinite, began to reveal its limits. Communities learned that metal did not simply appear. It demanded preparation, patience, and collective effort. Ore had to be found, wood had to be cut, charcoal had to be made, furnaces had to be tended. A single tool represented days of labor spread across many hands. The Copper Age taught people that creation was no longer solitary, it was communal. This realization altered how societies organized themselves. Groups formed around tasks rather than blood alone. Some gathered ore, others shaped clay for molds, others fed fires. Children grew watching these rhythms, learning that survival depended on coordination. Knowledge became inheritance. Techniques passed from parent to child, master to apprentice. The act of making became tradition. With tradition came identity. Certain valleys became known for their blades, certain hills for their ore, certain families for their craft. Reputation traveled faster than people. A tool's shape could tell where it was born. A dagger's balance could reveal its maker. Metal became a signature written in fire, yet even as specialization grew, no single center claimed dominance. Europe remained a mosaic of cultures, each adapting copper to its own rhythm. Some leaned toward trade, others toward defense, some wandered, others rooted. The Copper Age here did not unify, it diversified. In this diversity lay resilience. When one valley faltered, another adapted. When one route closed, another opened. The continent learned to breathe in many ways at once. Copper did not impose order, it revealed possibility. The age of wandering had become the age of choice. Over time, the wandering paths of Europe began to settle into memories written across the land. Hill forts remained on ridges even after danger passed, their earthworks softened by grass and rain. Trade routes became familiar veins, traced again and again by feet, hooves, and wheels. Rivers remembered the touch of boats. Forest clearings widened where fires had once burned for ore and charcoal. The Copper Age left no single monument, yet it transformed the continent into a landscape of connection. In these spaces between cultures, something subtle emerged, a sense that the world was shared. No valley stood alone anymore. Every community existed within a web of distant places, unseen hands, and borrowed knowledge. A blade might carry copper from a mountain never visited. A vessel might echo a shape first imagined beyond the horizon. Objects became messengers, quietly reminding people that their lives were part of something larger than their own fires. This awareness reshaped how people understood themselves. Identity was no longer bound only to birthplace, it could stretch. A person might grow in one valley and be buried in another. A craft learned in youth might be practiced among strangers. Belonging became layered, carried in memory and material rather than soil alone. Yet copper, for all its reach, remained gentle in its power. It bent, it wore. It asked to be repaired. Each broken edge reminded its owner that progress was fragile. The world still depended on care, patience, and renewal. In this fragility lay wisdom. Humanity learned that advancement did not mean invincibility, it meant responsibility. As centuries passed, new metals whispered from crucibles. Harder edges emerged, stronger forms waited. The Copper Age did not resist this future. It had prepared the ground. It had taught humanity how to experiment, how to share, how to organize, how to imagine change. Across Europe, beneath skies that had watched hunters, farmers, travelers, and warriors, the age of first metal softened into memory. But its lessons remained, etched into roots, rituals, and the quiet understanding that the world could be shaped. Fire had shown humanity that stone could bend. Copper had shown humanity that destiny could, too. Long after the first copper fires dimmed, long after valleys learned new names and rivers carried different tongues, the world still remembered that moment when stone first softened. Every blade, every wall, every road carried its echo. The Copper Age did not vanish. It settled beneath all that followed, like a quiet heartbeat beneath history. Across continents, people now lived within patterns born in that distant era. Cities rose where canals once taught cooperation. Kingdoms formed where trade had first stitched strangers together. Tools evolved, metals hardened, empires dreamed, but none of it would have been possible without that first human who struck a green-veined stone and watched it bend. In mountains, in deserts, in forests and plains, traces of that age still slept beneath the soil. Hammer stones rested beside ancient pits, molds lay buried in ash, beads of copper waited in forgotten graves. Each artifact whispered the same truth. Humanity had learned to change the world with intention. The Copper Age was not an age of heroes, it was an age of hands, of patient strikes beside small fires, of experiments that failed and were tried again, of people who did not know they were beginning something vast. They were only solving today's problems: how to sew hide more easily, how to cut wood more cleanly, how to make life a little gentler. Yet from those quiet intentions grew everything. Metal taught humans to look beyond what was given. Fire taught them that matter could be persuaded. Trade taught them that distance could be bridged. Craft taught them that knowledge could endure. By the time bronze gleamed and iron waited in shadow, humanity was no longer bound to stone or season. It had learned to dream in materials, to imagine futures in flame. The first metal dream was never about copper alone, it was about possibility. Even now, as you rest in a world of glass and light, of engines and endless signals, the Copper Age lives within your hands. Every tool you touch carries its ancestry in silence. Every structure around you remembers the first wall shaped by a metal edge. Every road echoes the paths once carved by traders who followed rivers with copper hidden in their packs. The distance between you and that ancient hearth is not as vast as it seems. People of the Copper Age never imagined empires, they never spoke of progress, they did not seek to master the world, they sought only to live a little better than yesterday, to mend what tore, to cut what resisted, to warm what was cold. Their genius was not ambition, it was attention. They watched how fire behaved, they listened to how stone responded, they noticed that some rocks shimmered differently, and in that noticing history turned. Each generation inherited not power but questions. What if this could be shaped? What if this could be softened? What if the earth itself could be taught? The answers unfolded slowly across centuries, across cultures, across lives that never met yet spoke through objects. A bead in Anatolia answered a blade in the Balkans. A furnace in Mesopotamia answered a mine in Egypt. Humanity learned not in isolation, but in echo. The Copper Age revealed something deeper than technology. It revealed that change is born from patience, that revolutions begin as curiosities, that the future is shaped by those who linger beside small fires and try again when the first attempt fails. The man who first bent copper did not know he was bending time, yet here you are in a world built upon that moment. As sleep draws near, you may imagine that ancient hearth. The soft crackle of wood, the glow against stone, a pair of hands, uncertain yet hopeful, lifting something new from the ashes. Let that image settle gently within you, because every age that followed, bronze, iron, steel, silicon, began there, in the quiet courage to touch the unknown. As the Copper Age slowly yielded to what would come next, it did not disappear in a single moment. It lingered, it overlapped, it whispered through workshops where copper and tin mingled in hesitant experiments. It lived in hands that still preferred the softer glow of familiar metal. It remained in rituals, in trade routes, in the rhythms of labor that had been learned beside early fires. In many lands, copper and bronze shared the world for generations. A farmer might carry a copper sickle while a warrior bore a harder blade. A village might still hammer native metal while a distant city poured alloys into molds. Progress did not arrive as a wave. It arrived as a tide, advancing, retreating, reshaping the shore with each quiet return. This gentleness is the Copper Age's final lesson. History is not made of sudden endings. It is woven from continuities. Every new age carries the fingerprints of the one before it. Bronze was born in copper's shadow, iron would rise upon bronze's foundation. Each step forward rested on habits already formed, the tending of fire, the shaping of molds, the sharing of knowledge, the organization of hands. Even the idea of innovation itself belonged to this first metal age. Before copper, tools were discovered. After copper, tools were invented. Humanity learned that materials could be transformed deliberately, that outcomes could be imagined before they existed. The world became a place of potential rather than fate. Communities that had learned to mine now learned to prospect. Those who had traded ore now traded ideas. Those who had built canals now built systems. The mental architecture of civilization, planning, coordination, foresight, was copper's true legacy. As this age softened into memory, it left no single monument behind. It left a mindset that the world is not fixed, that matter listens. That change begins in quiet curiosity, and in this knowledge, humanity stepped forward, carrying fire into the future. And now, as the long story of the first metal draws its circle closed, the world grows quiet once more. The fires that once flickered in Anatolian hills, in Balkan valleys, beside Nile stone, along Indus streets and beneath alpine snow soften into memory. Their glow does not vanish. It settles. It becomes the warmth beneath everything that followed. The Copper Age was never loud. It did not announce itself with empires or crowns. It arrived as a question held in the hands of ordinary people. What if this stone could change? What if fire could teach it? What if the earth itself was willing to become something new? From those gentle questions rose villages, trade routes, cities, rituals, tools, and dreams. Humanity learned to cooperate across distance, to plan beyond the season, to imagine futures shaped by intention rather than chance. It learned that knowledge could outlive a single life, that a discovery made beside a hearth could echo across continents. Even now, you live within those echoes. Every crafted object around you carries the memory of the first mold. Every structure remembers the first wall shaped by metal. Every system remembers the first attempt to organize labor and time. The Copper Age did not end. It became the foundation of becoming, so as you rest, you may let yourself drift back to that ancient night. The air is cool, the stars are bright. A small fire burns beside a shelter of clay and reed. Someone kneels beside it, holding a stone that gleams faintly green. They do not know what they are beginning. They only know that something feels different in their hands. The stone bends, the fire whispers, the world changes, and slowly, gently, history begins. When the last embers of the Copper Age settled into the soil, they did not fade into silence. They became a foundation. Across the world, humanity now carried an invisible inheritance, a way of thinking shaped by flame and patience. The earth was no longer only a place to endure. It was a partner in creation. Stone could be persuaded, fire could be guided, matter itself could be taught to become something new. In valleys where copper once glimmered, furnaces grew hotter. In workshops where simple beads were first hammered, molds deepened and sharpened. The skills learned beside early hearths matured into disciplines. Craftsmen no longer waited for native metal to appear in riverbeds. They sought it. They dug. They measured. They experimented. The world became a place of intention. Children born into this new era grew up watching transformation as part of life. They saw ore become blade, clay become vessel, wood become beam. They learned that nothing was fixed, that every object carried the memory of its making. The Copper Age had rewritten how people understood reality itself. Across lands once divided by distance, shared techniques created a quiet unity. A furnace in Mesopotamia resembled one in Anatolia. A mold in the Balkans echoed a form in Egypt. Fire had become a universal language. Even when words differed, the glow of molten metal spoke the same truth everywhere, that humanity could shape its world. Yet this knowledge remained gentle. Copper had taught restraint. It bent before it broke. It demanded care. It reminded people that power without patience failed. And so, as new metals whispered from crucibles, humanity approached them not with recklessness, but with the calm confidence born of long learning. The Copper Age did not give humanity dominion. It gave humanity understanding that the world is not a wall, it is a door. In the centuries that followed, humanity carried this understanding like a quiet flame from one generation to the next. It lived in the way a child watched a parent tend a fire. It lingered in the patience of a craftsperson shaping a mold. It echoed in the rhythm of a hammer striking metal, not in haste, but in conversation. The Copper Age had taught people to listen, to heat, to color, to resistance. Creation became dialogue. Workshops evolved into schools without walls. Knowledge moved through gesture and repetition, through story and demonstration. A young hand learned where to pause, when to strike, how to breathe with the fire. Mistakes were not failures, they were lessons. Each warped blade, each cracked mold, each imperfect pour became a teacher. The world itself became a classroom. This way of learning reshaped society. Experience mattered. Observation mattered. Elders held value not only for memory, but for method. Innovation did not replace tradition, it grew from it. New ideas stood upon old ones like layers of clay fired into permanence. Progress became cumulative rather than sudden. Across rivers and deserts, this mindset traveled faster than any caravan. A traveler did not need to bring a blade to change a village. They brought a technique, a rhythm, a way of seeing. The Copper Age had revealed that the most powerful thing to carry was not metal, but method. Even conflict began to change. Strategy replaced impulse. Preparation replaced chance. Communities learned that foresight could save more than strength. Planning became a form of protection. Fire taught patience. Metal taught consequence. Together they taught responsibility. The world no longer belonged only to the present moment. It belonged to tomorrow. People began to ask not only what do we need, but what will be needed. The future entered thought. And in that gentle shift, humanity crossed a threshold more important than any made of stone or bronze. It learned to think ahead. With this new sense of tomorrow, humanity began to inhabit time itself differently. Seasons were no longer only endured, they were anticipated. Rivers were no longer only followed, they were managed. The land was no longer merely inhabited, it was planned. The Copper Age had taught people to see beyond the edge of the present, to imagine outcomes before they existed, to prepare for worlds that had not yet arrived. Villages stored grain not only for winter, but for drought. Cities laid foundations meant to outlast those who placed them. Roads followed routes chosen not for ease alone, but for endurance. Firelight no longer marked only the end of a day. It marked continuity, the same glow seen by grandparents, parents, and children. The hearth became a bridge across generations. In workshops, this future-mindedness shaped every motion. A mold was carved knowing it would be used 100 times. A furnace was built knowing it would outlive its maker. Tools were repaired rather than discarded. Knowledge was preserved through repetition, not writing. The act of teaching became sacred. To pass on a technique was to extend oneself into the future. This change reached even into the way people understood themselves. Life was no longer only a single arc between birth and death. It became part of a longer chain. Each person stood between ancestors and descendants, carrying forward something learned, something shaped, something improved. The Copper Age had given humanity a sense of inheritance beyond blood. Across the world, this mindset prepared societies for the next transformation. When bronze hardened in crucibles, people were ready. They already understood alloys, heat, and intention. They already knew that progress came from patience. The leap forward did not feel like a rupture. It felt like a continuation. Fire had taught them to wait. Copper had taught them to try. Time had taught them to remember. And in this quiet alignment of past, present, and future, humanity became something new, not merely a survivor of the world, but a steward of what might be. And so, as the first metal age receded into memory, it did not leave behind an ending. It left behind a way of being. Humanity had learned that the world could be shaped, but also that shaping required care. That fire could transform, but also destroy. That knowledge could empower, but only when shared. The Copper Age had been gentle in its lessons, yet profound in its reach. Across fields and rivers, beneath forests and deserts, the earth still held the marks of those first experiments. Shallow mines slept beneath moss. Charcoal lingered in forgotten hearths. Broken molds lay buried in ash. Each trace was a quiet testament to curiosity, the most powerful force the age had awakened. People had dared to ask what might be possible. They had dared to fail. They had dared to try again. This courage became inheritance. It passed invisibly from hand to hand, from generation to generation. Even as bronze replaced copper and iron later followed, the spirit of that first discovery endured. Every innovation carried the echo of a moment when someone paused beside a fire and wondered, what if? What if stone could change? What if fire could teach? What if the world could become something new? Those questions never stopped being asked. They are asked in every workshop, in every laboratory, in every place where human hands meet material and imagine more. The Copper Age was not merely a chapter in history. It was the moment humanity realized that tomorrow could be different, and that realization, quiet, patient, glowing, is still shaping the world. As the echoes of the Copper Age stretched forward into new centuries, humanity found itself standing within a world forever altered by its own hands. The glow of early furnaces had taught people that transformation was not a miracle bestowed from the sky, it was a dialogue between intention and matter. The earth had become a partner in imagination. Stone no longer marked the limit of possibility, it marked the beginning. Across distant lands, children grew up in homes shaped by metal tools, beneath roofs cut more cleanly, beside vessels formed with deliberate curves. They did not know a world without crafted edges. They inherited a reality where change was expected, where improvement felt natural, where the act of making carried meaning beyond survival. The Copper Age had quietly redefined what it meant to be human. Communities now lived within layered time. The past lingered in walls and roads. The future waited in plans and preparations. Fire burned not only for warmth, but for continuity. Each hearth became a bridge between generations. A child watching molten metal flow learned more than technique. They learned that the world listens. In valleys where copper had once been rare, workshops multiplied. In places where trade routes first stitched strangers together, networks deepened into systems. People began to understand that their actions rippled outward, touching lives unseen. A blade forged in one village might clear fields in another. A method taught in one valley might shape a city beyond the horizon. This awareness softened isolation. No place stood entirely alone anymore. Every community existed within a web of shared knowledge, borrowed ideas, and inherited craft. Humanity had become a single conversation carried across fire and time. The Copper Age had not given people dominion over nature. It had given them relationship between hand and stone, between fire and form, between today and tomorrow. And in that relationship, a new kind of world began to breathe. With this new sense of connection came a quiet humility. People began to understand that every creation carried a history deeper than their own lives. A blade was not only a blade, it was the mountain it came from, the forest that fed the fire, the hands that shaped it, and the lessons learned through countless failed attempts before it. Each object became a story folded into matter. This awareness changed how communities treated their tools and spaces. Items were repaired rather than discarded. Hearths were cleaned with reverence. Workshops were arranged with care, as if the order of the room reflected the order of the world. Craft became ritual. Even the simplest act, reshaping a bent edge, reheating a dull blade, carried a sense of continuity across regions. People began to recognize one another not only by speech or clothing, but by technique. The curve of a vessel, the balance of an axe, the pattern of a mold revealed lineage. A traveler could hold an unfamiliar tool and feel kinship with the unseen maker. Fire had given humanity a shared language written in form. This shared language softened borders. It allowed strangers to cooperate. It allowed ideas to cross rivers before armies ever would. Where words failed, demonstration succeeded. A single evening beside a furnace could teach more than months of travel. Knowledge leapt like flame from hearth to hearth. Even belief systems shifted. Creation myths began to mirror craft. Gods shaped worlds from chaos as humans shaped blades from ore. The act of making became sacred because it echoed divine order. To transform matter was to participate in something eternal. The Copper Age had not only altered how people lived, it altered how they understood existence. The world was no longer merely given, it was becoming. As this new understanding spread, humanity began to see itself not as a guest upon the earth, but as a participant in its unfolding. Forests were no longer endless shadows, they were sources of heat. Mountains were no longer silent giants, they were reservoirs of potential. Rivers were no longer only paths of water, they were lifelines of exchange and memory. The Copper Age had taught people to read the land as a living partner, one that responded to care and caution alike. This awareness reshaped settlement itself. Villages chose their places with foresight, near water, near wood, near soil that could be shaped and sustained. Cities formed where roots crossed, where exchange could breathe. The map of the world began to mirror intention rather than chance. Each hearth became a small center of transformation, each community a node in a widening web of human presence. People learned that nothing existed in isolation. A single furnace depended on forests, a single blade depended on mountains, a single harvest depended on tools, water, and weather. Life revealed itself as a chain of relationships stretching outward beyond sight. The Copper Age had dissolved the illusion of independence. Survival was shared. This realization carried gentleness within it. It encouraged restraint. It taught that excess weakened the web. That waste echoed outward. That imbalance invited consequence. Even before laws were written, people sensed that the world listened, that the land remembered, and so humanity stepped forward with new care, not perfect, not wise in every choice, but aware. Aware that every flame altered something ancient, aware that every tool carried history, aware that the future would be shaped by what was chosen now. The Copper Age had not merely changed how people made things, it changed how people belonged. With this belonging came responsibility, though it was not yet named as such. It lived quietly in habit and hesitation, in the pause before cutting a tree, in the care taken to rebuild a hearth, in the instinct to teach rather than hoard. The Copper Age had taught humanity that power without understanding was fragile. Fire could warm, but it could also devour. Metal could serve, but it could also wound. Every gift carried a shadow. Communities began to weave this awareness into story. Tales emerged of mountains angered by greed, of rivers that withdrew when disrespected, of fire that punished carelessness. These were not merely myths, they were memory shaped into warning. Through them, children learned that the world responded, that actions echoed beyond a single life. That to shape matter was also to shape consequence. Even conflict carried new weight. War was no longer only a clash of bodies, it became a clash of systems, of supply, of coordination, of knowledge. Victory depended not only on strength, but on preparation, on foresight, on the ability to sustain effort over time. The Copper Age had taught humanity that endurance often mattered more than force, yet this same lesson nurtured peace. Communities that understood interdependence also understood fragility. Trade flourished where violence would have broken the web. Exchange became survival. A tool given in goodwill might prevent a wound tomorrow. Metal, once born of fire, learned to serve connection. As this age deepened, humanity no longer saw itself as drifting through a static world. It saw itself as shaping a living process. The earth became a story still being written. Every hearth added a line. Every tool left a mark. The Copper Age had given humanity its first sense of authorship. Not over the world, but within it. Time continued its gentle work, carrying humanity forward on currents first stirred beside copper fires. Generations were born into worlds already shaped by intention. They did not remember a time before tools could be remade, before stone could soften, before matter could answer the hand. To them, change felt natural. The world was something one learned to speak with, not merely endure. In these later centuries, knowledge no longer lived only in memory. It lived in practice, in the way a furnace was built, in the angle of a mold, in the rhythm of hammer against metal. A traveler could enter an unfamiliar village and recognize its lineage by the shape of its hearth. Fire had become culture. Across lands, techniques diverged and flourished. Some regions favored casting, others perfected hammering, some valued ornament, others sought strength. Each place shaped metal in its own image and in doing so shaped itself. The Copper Age had become a tapestry of identities, woven from shared beginnings and local dreams. People learned that mastery was not dominance but dialogue. A skilled craftsperson listened to color, to sound, to resistance. The glow of metal revealed its readiness. The hiss of cooling told its story. Creation became a conversation with matter. Every finished object carried the memory of patience. This way of thinking reached beyond workshops. Farmers planned fields with foresight. Builders imagined roofs before raising walls. Leaders measured seasons before calling labor. The future became something one could prepare for rather than fear. The Copper Age had taught humanity that tomorrow could be shaped. And so, in villages and cities, beside rivers and hills, beneath skies unchanged since the first hearth, people lived with a quiet confidence. They were no longer only inhabitants of the world, they were participants in its becoming. With participation came memory, not memory written in symbols, but memory embedded in motion. A child learned where to place wood in a furnace by watching a parent's hands. They learned when to withdraw a blade by the color of its glow. They learned when to wait, when to strike, when to stop. Knowledge did not need words, it lived in the body. It passed through muscle and instinct, through rhythm and breath. In this way, humanity began to carry history within itself. Techniques survived even when villages moved. Methods endured even when homes turned to dust. A people displaced by drought or conflict could rebuild their world elsewhere because the world now lived inside them. The Copper Age had made culture portable. Across landscapes, this portability reshaped resilience. Where floods erased fields, new ones were planned. Where forests vanished, trade replaced wood. Where ore ran thin, roots extended. Communities learned to adapt without forgetting. The world no longer ended at the edge of the known. It began there. Travelers became teachers. A single craftsperson might transform a valley by sharing a technique. A furnace built in one place echoed in another. Progress no longer depended on proximity. It moved with people. The horizon became a classroom. Even failure became fertile. A cracked mold revealed weakness. A dulled blade suggested change. Each imperfection invited refinement. The Copper Age taught humanity that mistakes were not endings, but beginnings in disguise. Creation became an ongoing conversation between desire and reality. This mindset reached into every corner of life. Parenting became preparation. Leadership became stewardship. Community became continuity. People began to understand that what they built would outlast them, and that this was not tragedy, but meaning. The Copper Age had given humanity more than metal. It had given humanity a future. As humanity learned to carry its world within itself, the distance between place and identity began to soften. A person was no longer only of a valley or river. They were of a method, a rhythm, a way of shaping. Culture became something that traveled in hands rather than roots. The Copper Age had untied belonging from soil and fastened it to knowledge. This shift altered how people faced uncertainty. When the land changed, when rivers wandered or skies withheld rain, communities no longer felt wholly unmoored. They carried with them the means to rebuild. Fire could be kindled anywhere, clay could be found in any valley, stone slept beneath every hill. The world was full of potential if one knew how to listen. Settlements began to appear in places once thought inhospitable. Hills became homes, coasts became workshops, deserts became roots. The map of habitation widened. Humanity learned that survival was not bound to a single landscape, but to the ability to transform what was found. Metalwork stood at the heart of this realization. A furnace built in one land could be rebuilt in another. A mold carved in one village could be remembered in a new home. Fire did not belong to any one place. It belonged to those who understood it. In this way, the Copper Age taught that power could be carried lightly. Even spiritual life shifted. Sacredness no longer lived only in mountains or rivers. It lived in process, in the act of making, in the transformation itself. Creation became ritual. A blade born of fire echoed the birth of the world. Each hearth became a small center of meaning. Humanity had not escaped nature. It had learned to converse with it. The land no longer spoke only in storms and seasons. It spoke in color, texture, resistance, and yield. People listened. They adjusted. They tried again. The Copper Age did not make the world predictable. It made humanity adaptable. In this adaptability lay the quiet triumph of the first Metal Age. Humanity no longer faced change as an ending, but as a condition of life. Flood, drought, migration, loss, these no longer erased identity. They reshaped it. The skills learned beside copper fires traveled farther than any caravan, settling into new lands with the same calm persistence that once shaped stone into blade. Wherever people went, they carried an invisible hearth. They knew how to gather fuel, how to raise flame, how to listen for the color of readiness. They knew how to shape clay, how to read heat, how to coax order from raw earth. The world became a place of endless beginnings rather than fixed limits. Every valley held the possibility of a home. Every river bend could become a future. This way of living softened fear. The unknown no longer meant ruin. It meant opportunity. A mountain was not only a barrier, it was a source. A forest was not only shadow, it was fuel. A desert was not only absence, it was a path. The Copper Age had taught humanity to see potential where once there had been only boundary. Even death began to feel different. Graves filled with tools were not only farewells. They were acknowledgements that a life had contributed something enduring. A blade laid beside a body said, "This person shaped the world." Memory was no longer only spoken. It was placed into the earth as matter. And so, generation by generation, humanity learned to exist within a moving story, not as passive characters but as co-authors. Each hearth added a chapter. Each invention shifted the plot. Each journey expanded the map. The Copper Age did not end when copper gave way to bronze. It ended when humanity no longer saw the world as fixed. From that moment on, the future became something that could be made. Long before calendars divided years, and before maps claimed the world in ink, humanity had already learned the most powerful lesson it would ever need, that existence itself could be shaped. The Copper Age had opened a door in the human mind, one that would never close. Beyond that threshold lay the idea that reality was not fixed, that the world was not merely inherited but negotiated. Across continents, people now lived inside a quiet transformation. Fields were planned before seeds touched soil. Walls were imagined before the first stone was laid. Journeys were charted before feet left home. Thought began to travel ahead of action. The future entered the present. This was the true inheritance of copper, not the blade, not the bead, not the ornament, but the awareness that intention mattered, that patience could alter fate. That a single experiment beside a small fire could echo across centuries. Communities no longer asked only, how do we survive? They began to ask, how do we live well? This shift was subtle, almost invisible. It did not arrive with ceremony. It emerged in daily choices, in the decision to repair instead of discard, to teach instead of hide, to plan instead of react. It lived in the careful stacking of firewood, in the saving of grain, in the shaping of a mold that would outlast its maker. The world became a canvas of small foresights. A bridge built to endure, a path cleared for those yet unborn, a furnace raised where no one had stood before. Humanity learned to leave space for the future. In this new rhythm, time itself felt different. The past became teacher, the present became workshop, the future became invitation. Life unfolded not as a cycle alone, but as a line stretching forward, carrying memory within it. The Copper Age had given humanity its first true power, not the power to dominate, but the power to imagine what had never been. Imagination began to move more freely than any caravan. It crossed rivers before bridges existed. It climbed mountains long before paths were cut. It settled into minds as a quiet question, what else could this become? The Copper Age had taught humanity to see rawness not as limit, but as invitation. A stone was no longer merely a stone. It was a future tool. Clay was no longer mud. It was a vessel waiting to breathe. Fire was no longer danger. It was dialogue. This way of seeing reshaped how people looked at one another. A stranger was no longer only unknown. They might carry a method, a story, a solution. Encounters became exchanges of possibility. A traveler arriving with a new technique could change a valley. A visitor showing a different mold could alter a craft that had stood unchanged for generations. The world became porous. Ideas flowed like rivers. Children grew up in this openness. They learned that curiosity was not defiance. It was inheritance. When they asked why a blade bent, why a furnace cracked, why a pot shattered, they were participating in a tradition older than cities. Every question joined a lineage that began beside the first hearth. Elders no longer guarded knowledge as sacred mystery alone. They shared it as continuity. To teach was to extend oneself beyond the body. A technique passed on became a form of immortality. The Copper Age had taught humanity that a person could outlive themselves in skill. Even the natural world began to appear differently. Storms were no longer only wrath, they were forces to observe. Floods were not only destruction, they were patterns to understand. Fire itself, once feared, then tamed, became a metaphor for change. People learned that the same flame could warm or ruin, depending on how it was held. This understanding carried gentleness within it. It softened arrogance. It reminded humanity that power was always paired with responsibility. To shape the world was also to answer for what was shaped. Thus, imagination became paired with care. The Copper Age had not merely opened minds, it had taught them to listen. As imagination took root in daily life, humanity began to sense that it was no longer merely moving through time, it was shaping it. The seasons still turned. Rivers still rose and fell, yet within these ancient rhythms, a new current flowed. People planned for winters not yet felt. They built for descendants they would never meet. They acted with a quiet faith that the future was worth preparing for. This faith transformed labor into legacy. A bridge was no longer only a crossing, it was a gift to unknown travelers. A furnace was no longer only a tool, it was a promise that craft would continue after the hands that built it had stilled. Each object became a message carried forward through time. The Copper Age had made this possible by teaching continuity. Fire did not belong to a single night. It could be kept, shared, rekindled. Knowledge followed the same path. A method learned in one generation lived in the next. Civilization became a chain of remembered gestures. This altered how people faced loss. Death no longer meant disappearance alone. It meant transition. A craftsperson lived on in every blade shaped by their students. A builder endured in every wall that stood. Memory became material. Legacy became touchable. Across landscapes, this sense of enduring presence reshaped community. People gathered not only for survival but for meaning. Rituals honored makers. Stories preserved techniques. Songs carried instruction. Culture became a vessel for time. Humanity had discovered that it could speak to the future. Not with words carved in stone, but with habits, with systems. With ways of seeing, the Copper Age had given people a voice beyond their own lifetime. In this new awareness, the world itself began to feel like a story still being written. Every generation added a page, every hearth a paragraph. Every tool a sentence shaped in fire and patience. Humanity no longer stood at the mercy of time, it walked beside it. The Copper Age had taught people that even the smallest act could ripple outward. A better blade meant a larger harvest. A stronger roof meant a safer winter. A shared technique meant a distant village could endure. Change was no longer thunderous, it was cumulative. It gathered quietly like light at dawn. This understanding softened fear of the unknown. The future was no longer an abyss, it was a space of possibility. People learned that uncertainty did not always mean danger. It could mean opportunity. A new valley might hold new ore. A new neighbor might hold new knowledge. A new idea might reshape a way of life. Communities became more than collections of lives. They became vessels for continuity. Each child born into the world inherited not only blood and language, but methods, rhythms, and ways of seeing. Culture became a form of memory that outlived any single voice. The Copper Age had changed the meaning of inheritance. It was no longer only land or name, it was knowledge. It was curiosity. It was the courage to try again. Through this, humanity stepped beyond mere survival. It entered a long conversation with time itself, one that would carry it through bronze, through iron, through ages yet unimagined. And all of it began beside a small fire, with a stone that bent instead of breaking. By the time the Copper Age had woven itself into every corner of human life, the world no longer felt like a place that merely happened. It felt like a place that responded. Hills offered awe. Rivers offered passage, forests offered flame. The earth itself seemed to answer those who learned how to listen. Humanity had entered into a dialogue with existence. This dialogue changed how people understood struggle. Hardship was no longer only endured, it was addressed. A drought inspired new channels. A harsh winter led to better shelters. A broken tool invited refinement. Problems became invitations rather than endings. The Copper Age had reframed adversity into possibility. Across continents, societies began to mirror this mindset. Leadership was no longer only strength, it became foresight. A good leader was one who could imagine winter before snow fell, who could see hunger in the seed, who could sense danger in silence. Planning became power, vision became survival. This reshaped communities at every scale. Families saved. Villages coordinated, regions cooperated. People learned that the future could be built piece by piece, like a blade shaped from ore. Each decision mattered, each improvement accumulated, even the sky felt different beneath this awareness. Stars became guides, seasons became maps. Time itself felt navigable. Humanity no longer drifted through years, it traveled through them. The Copper Age had not given people certainty, it had given them direction. And in that direction, the world began to open. With direction came patience. People learned that change did not need to be rushed. Fire itself taught this lesson. Too much heat ruined the metal, too little left it stubborn and unformed. Between these extremes lay the quiet art of timing. Humanity began to understand that every transformation had its own rhythm, and that wisdom lived in waiting. This patience spread beyond workshops. Fields were prepared long before seeds touched soil. Timber was cut and left to season. Stone was gathered months before walls were raised. Effort became layered. One task prepared the ground for another. The present became an act of care for the future. Such thinking softened the edge of uncertainty. A failed harvest no longer felt like the end of a story. It became a chapter that demanded response. Communities gathered. Stores were opened, plans were reshaped. The Copper Age had taught people that resilience was not strength alone, it was adaptability woven through time. Elders became guardians of rhythm. They remembered which rivers wandered, which hills collapsed, which winters lingered. Their knowledge guided action. Youth learned that speed was not always wisdom, that some things must be allowed to become. Even conflict began to change in this light. Preparation replaced impulse. Strategy replaced rage. People learned that lasting victory often came from endurance rather than force. The Copper Age had taught them that shaping the world was a long conversation, not a single shout. In this way, humanity grew into time itself, no longer only reacting, no longer only surviving, but learning when to wait and when to act. As patience settled into the fabric of human life, the pace of the world itself seemed to soften. Days were no longer only counted by hunger and rest, but by intention. Morning became preparation, evening became reflection. Firelight no longer marked merely the end of labor, it marked continuity, the quiet promise that tomorrow would be shaped by what was done today. Communities began to live with a deeper sense of rhythm. Work followed the seasons, yet also transcended them. A furnace built in summer would serve in winter. A wall raised in youth would shelter old age. People learned to think in arcs rather than moments. Life became something extended across time, not confined to the present breath. This shift altered how people understood effort. Labor was no longer only necessity, it became contribution. Each action fed into a larger pattern. A child carrying wood was not only helping for the night, it was sustaining a lineage of fire. A craftsperson shaping a mold was not only making a tool, it was shaping a future hand. The Copper Age had revealed that nothing stood alone. Every object was a convergence of many lives. Ore carried the mountain. Charcoal carried the forest. A blade carried the knowledge of countless experiments. In every finished form, the world itself was present. This awareness deepened respect. Waste felt heavier. Carelessness felt costly. People began to sense that to damage one thread was to strain the whole web. The land, the craft, the community, all were bound. Humanity had learned that creation was not conquest, it was relationship. And in that relationship, the world began to feel like home rather than obstacle. Home, once defined by shelter alone, now grew into something deeper. It became a network of meanings: hearth, path, field, workshop, memory. A place was no longer merely where one slept. It was where one shaped, where one contributed, where one belonged within a living chain. The Copper Age had expanded the idea of dwelling from space into time. People began to speak of ancestors not only as those who came before, but as those who had built before. A wall carried a name. A canal remembered hands. A tool recalled its maker long after voice had faded. The past was no longer distant. It stood quietly in daily life. This closeness to history softened loneliness. Even in loss, one did not stand alone. Every act of making connected the present to countless unseen companions across generations. A person at a furnace was never truly solitary. They worked beside those who had taught them, and for those who would one day learn. The Copper Age had created a world in which meaning was embedded in matter. Every object became a witness. Every structure became a story. Time itself felt layered, gentle, continuous, and so humanity learned to live not only in the world but with it, not against the land, not apart from history, but as part of a long unfolding. The first metal had taught people how to shape stone, but more quietly, it had taught them how to belong. By now, humanity no longer stood at the edge of the world in wonder. It stood within it, aware that every place carried potential and every moment carried weight. The Copper Age had taught people that existence was not something that merely happened to them, it was something they participated in. Each hearth became a small center of creation. Each settlement a quiet experiment in continuity. Across valleys and coasts, people began to sense that they were part of something vast and ongoing. Not a single tribe or lineage, but a shared human current flowing through time. A blade shaped in one land might influence a harvest in another. A technique born beside one river might change lives beyond the horizon. The world felt connected in ways no map could yet show. This awareness reshaped humility. No one person could claim the whole story. Every achievement rested on forgotten hands. Every advance depended on countless small acts of care. Greatness became collective. Progress became shared. The Copper Age had revealed that civilization was not built by heroes alone, but by generations who kept tending the fire. In this world, even silence held meaning. The pause before striking metal, the stillness before pouring molten ore, the quiet of evening after labor, these moments became sacred. They reminded people that creation required listening as much as action. That change was born in attention. The rhythm of life slowed and deepened. Time no longer rushed forward as an enemy, it became a companion. People learned that some things must unfold, that not every transformation could be forced, that the world answered best when approached with patience. Humanity had learned a new posture toward existence, not grasping, not fleeing, but standing, hands open, ready to shape and to be shaped. In this open-handed way of living, humanity discovered a quieter form of strength. It was not found in walls alone, nor in weapons, nor in wealth. It lived in continuity, the ability to begin again without forgetting, to adapt without erasing, to move forward while carrying the past. The Copper Age had taught people that endurance was not rigidity, it was memory combined with motion. Across generations, this strength appeared in small, almost invisible ways. A mother taught her child how to judge the color of heated clay. A grandfather showed how to align stones so they would not shift in winter frost. A traveler shared a better knot for binding a handle. None of these acts felt grand, yet each one altered the future. Each one extended a fragile thread through time. Communities began to recognize that their greatest wealth was not stored in jars or fields, but in people who remembered, the keeper of stories, the elder who recalled past floods, the craftsperson who understood why a furnace once collapsed. Experience became a form of treasure. To lose it was to lose part of oneself. This recognition softened ambition. It reminded leaders that authority without wisdom was hollow. It reminded warriors that victory without continuity was empty. It reminded builders that walls without meaning would not endure. The Copper Age had quietly aligned progress with responsibility. Even as new metals whispered from crucibles and stronger blades waited beyond the horizon, humanity carried copper's gentleness forward. It remembered that power must be guided, that fire must be tended, that change must be earned through patience. The world was no longer something to conquer. It was something to learn from. And in that learning, humanity found a path that did not end with any single age, but continued, quietly, steadily, into everything that would follow. As the long inheritance of copper settled into every corner of human life, people began to sense that the world itself was shaped by remembrance. Hills bore terraces where hands had once labored. Rivers followed channels first cut by ancestors. Paths curved where countless feet had chosen the gentlest slope. The land became a living archive, carrying the imprint of intention across generations. To walk through such a landscape was to move through time. Every stone wall whispered of the season it was raised. Every hearth carried the warmth of those who had once gathered there. Even abandoned places spoke, through collapsed roofs, through ash mingled with soil, through tools half buried in grass. The Copper Age had taught humanity that nothing truly vanished. It transformed, and in transforming, it continued to speak. This awareness changed how people treated ruins. An empty village was not merely loss, it was memory made visible. It reminded those who passed that others had stood where they stood, had struggled, had hoped, had shaped. The past became a companion on every journey. The future felt less lonely because it was already inhabited by echoes. In this world, creation no longer meant erasing what came before, it meant building with it. Stones from fallen walls were reused, timber from old roofs became new beams. Clay from broken vessels returned to the earth to be shaped again. Nothing was wasted. Everything was part of a longer cycle. The Copper Age had revealed that progress did not require forgetting, it required weaving. Each generation added a layer without tearing away the last. Civilization became a palimpsest, written, erased, and written again, yet never wholly lost. Humanity had learned that time itself could be crafted not by stopping it, not by conquering it, but by honoring what it carried forward, and so humanity learned to walk gently within its own story. Each generation became both heir and architect, receiving a world shaped by unseen hands, and reshaping it in turn for those yet to come. The Copper Age had planted this understanding deep within the human spirit, that nothing stands alone, and that every act joins a chain far longer than a single life. People no longer measured existence only by years lived, but by marks left behind. A field cleared, a path traced, a furnace built, a child taught. These became the true measures of time. Even the smallest contribution mattered because it entered a living continuum. The world became a tapestry woven from countless quiet gestures. This perspective softened endings. Death no longer felt like disappearance alone. A life endured in what it had shaped, in the skills passed on, in the tools still in use, in the walls that still sheltered, in the paths that still guided. Each person became a thread in a fabric that outlasted breath. The Copper Age had taught humanity how to leave traces that mattered. Not monuments alone, but methods. Not symbols alone, but systems. It had shown that the most powerful inheritance was not wealth, but wisdom embodied in habit and hand. Even as bronze hardened and iron waited beyond the horizon, this lesson remained. Every new age would build upon it. Every future would be shaped by it. Because before there could be empires, there had to be continuity. Before there could be machines, there had to be patience. Before there could be progress, there had to be the courage to imagine and the humility to learn. The first metal had bent beneath fire. Humanity had bent with it. And in that shared transformation, the world had begun to remember itself. With every passing generation, humanity grew more fluent in the language of becoming. The world no longer felt like a mystery imposed from beyond. It felt like a conversation unfolding from within. Mountains, rivers, forests, and skies still carried their ancient power, but now they were met with understanding rather than awe alone. The Copper Age had taught people that nature was not an enemy to overcome, nor a deity to fear, but a presence to engage. This engagement reshaped how people perceived effort. Work was no longer merely survival, it became dialogue. A field plowed was a question asked of soil, a canal cut was a request made of water, a furnace lit was an invitation extended to stone. Each act of labor became an exchange between human intention and the world's response. Communities began to sense that they were shaping not only their surroundings, but themselves. To build a wall was to learn stability. To tend a fire was to learn restraint. To pass on a technique was to learn generosity. The Copper Age had woven character into craft, ethics into effort, meaning into motion. Across distant lands, people who would never meet shared this same inner shift. A craftsperson in a river valley and a traveler crossing open plains both carried the same quiet certainty, that the world could be changed, and that such change carried responsibility. Even without shared language, they recognized one another in gesture, in rhythm, in the way hands moved with purpose. The human story no longer drifted, it advanced with awareness, not rushing, not resisting, but moving as fire moves through wood, transforming without erasing. The Copper Age had not merely opened the future, it had taught humanity how to walk into it. Walking into the future required trust. Trust that effort would matter, that change would not erase meaning, that tomorrow could be shaped without destroying yesterday. This trust did not arise from hope alone. It was earned beside countless hearths, in villages rebuilt after storms, in tools repaired rather than discarded. The Copper Age had taught humanity that endurance was not found in stone, but in continuity. People learned to see themselves as part of a living chain. A hand striking metal echoed hands long gone. A child watching that strike became the next link. Time no longer felt like a river sweeping life away. It felt like a road on which each generation placed a stone. The path grew not because one person built it, but because many refused to stop. This perspective softened ambition. It reminded even the boldest that greatness was layered. No wall rose in a single day. No craft reached mastery in a single life. Progress became something that could be contributed to, rather than possessed. A person did not need to finish the story to matter. They only needed to add a line. In this way, the Copper Age reshaped humility. It taught that knowledge was never owned, only carried. That a technique existed before one learned it and would exist after one was gone. To practice craft was to serve a lineage. To innovate was to honor it. Even failure gained dignity. A cracked vessel, a warped blade, a collapsed furnace. These were not signs of weakness. They were steps along a path. Each mistake taught the hand. Each flaw refined understanding. Creation became a conversation with imperfection. Humanity learned that the world did not demand perfection, it asked for participation. And so, generation after generation, people stepped forward, not knowing where the road would end, but knowing that it could be walked, shaped, and shared. Participation became the quiet heartbeat of civilization. People no longer waited for the world to define them. They engaged with it, shaping and being shaped in return. Every hearth was a place of dialogue, every field a question posed to the earth, every road a conversation with distance. The Copper Age had taught humanity that existence itself could be collaborative. This understanding reshaped how communities faced uncertainty. Storms still came, rivers still wandered, crops still failed, yet these events no longer felt like divine endings. They were challenges within an ongoing relationship. A flood meant new channels, a drought meant new methods. A loss meant rebuilding. The future was no longer something that happened to people. It was something people met. Work in this world carried dignity, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. A person gathering wood fed more than a fire, they sustained a lineage of warmth. A child carrying water upheld a network of care. A craftsperson shaping a mold shaped generations. Every role became a thread in a shared fabric. This fabric extended across cultures. Though languages differed and customs diverged, the rhythm of making remained recognizable. The glow of a furnace in one land mirrored the glow in another. The careful pause before pouring molten metal felt the same beneath every sky. Humanity had found a common pulse. The Copper Age had not erased difference. It had revealed unity beneath it. A unity born not of rule or conquest, but of shared engagement with the world. And within that unity, humanity learned that it did not walk alone through time. It walked together. Togetherness did not mean sameness. It meant resonance. A rhythm felt across distance. A recognition carried without words. People in far valleys and distant plains could sense that they were part of the same unfolding story, even if they never met. The Copper Age had taught humanity that connection did not require closeness. It required continuity. This continuity reshaped how people faced the unknown. The horizon no longer marked the edge of safety. It became an invitation. Beyond it might lie new ore, new soil, new companions, new ideas. Exploration no longer meant abandonment, it meant extension. Each journey carried a piece of home into unfamiliar ground. Communities began to view movement as growth rather than loss. When people left, they did not sever the chain, they lengthened it. A traveler carried techniques, rhythms, and memories into new landscapes. A settlement founded far away still burned the same kind of fire. The world became threaded with invisible lines of shared practice. Even solitude changed its meaning. A person alone beside a hearth was never truly isolated. They stood within a lineage of hands that had kindled flame before them and would do so after. Every spark connected past and future in a single breath of light. The Copper Age had revealed that belonging was not confined to place. It lived in action, in method, in care. Wherever a person shaped matter with intention, they stood within humanity's long conversation with the world. And so, as new ages waited beyond the horizon, humanity carried with it something more enduring than any metal. The knowledge that it could face change not with fear but with curiosity, not with isolation but with continuity, not with silence but with shared flame. The world would keep changing. But now, so would humanity together. By now, the human world no longer felt like a scattering of fragile shelters beneath an indifferent sky. It felt like a living network, of hearths, of hands, of knowledge traveling quietly through time. The Copper Age had stitched humanity into a single, slow-moving organism, one that learned, remembered, and adapted. Each generation inherited not only land and story, but a way of engaging with existence itself. People began to sense that they were participants in something far larger than any village or lifetime. A furnace built in one era influenced the shape of tools in the next. A path cleared through forest became a road for descendants. A lesson taught beside a fire echoed through hands not yet born. The present stretched forward, touching futures unseen. This awareness transformed identity. A person was no longer defined only by family or place. They were defined by contribution, what they built, what they taught, what they preserved. Even the smallest act, a sharpened blade, a shared method, a repaired wall entered the long human current. Communities started to celebrate not only ancestors, but continuity itself. Rituals honored craft, stories remembered the first makers. Children learned that to shape the world was to belong to it. Making became meaning. The Copper Age had revealed a quiet truth. That history is not written only by those who rule, but by those who tend, those who repair, those who pass on what they know. Humanity was no longer merely surviving through time, it was building a conversation with it. In this long conversation with time, even the smallest spaces gained depth. A workshop became more than a place of labor, it became a classroom of generations. A hearth became more than warmth, it became a center of memory. A path became more than a route, it became a story written by countless feet. The world filled with layers, each one resting gently upon the last. People learned to notice these layers. They paused beside old walls and wondered who had set the first stone. They touched worn tools and imagined the hands that had shaped them. The past was no longer distant. It breathed quietly through matter. Every object became a bridge between lives that would never meet. This awareness softened haste. It reminded people that nothing meaningful was made in a moment. A blade required ore, fire, patience. A home required seasons. A culture required centuries. The Copper Age had taught humanity that slowness could be strength. That endurance was born not from speed, but from care. Communities began to measure success differently, not by conquest alone, but by continuity. A village that endured storms and famine through cooperation was strong. A family that passed on skill through hardship was rich. A people that remembered how to begin again was powerful. Even the idea of greatness changed. It no longer belonged only to those who stood above others. It belonged to those who left something useful behind, a better way to shape a mold, a safer method to build a roof, a story that reminded children how to listen. In this world, to live well was to leave the ground a little kinder than one had found it. The Copper Age had given humanity a new measure of worth, not what you take, not what you own, but what you pass forward. Passing forward became the quiet law of human progress. No decree announced it, no monument enforced it. It lived in habit, in instinct, in the simple understanding that what one learned should not die with one's breath. The Copper Age had taught people that knowledge was too precious to be private. A technique hidden was a future denied. A method shared was a world extended. In villages and camps beside rivers and hills, elders began to speak with purpose. Not only of what had been done, but of how it had been done. Stories no longer served memory alone, they became instruction. A tale about a failed harvest carried a lesson in timing. A legend of a great maker concealed a method of shaping. Wisdom hid within narrative, traveling farther than any blade. Children grew up surrounded by invisible teachers. Every wall showed how stones should rest. Every hearth showed how fire should breathe. Every tool carried the posture of its maker. The world itself became a guidebook written in matter. One did not need to be told how to belong. One learned by touching. This changed how people understood inheritance. Land could be lost, homes could burn. Even family lines could fade, but skill endured. Knowledge traveled. A person displaced by storm or conflict could still rebuild because the world now lived within them. The Copper Age had made humanity portable. Across continents, this portability transformed resilience. When one place failed, another rose. When one method faltered, another emerged. The human story no longer depended on a single center. It moved like fire carried from hearth to hearth, never extinguished, only changing shape. Humanity had learned that survival was not found in walls alone. It was found in what could be taught. To teach became the highest form of creation. A blade could be lost, a house could fall, but a lesson once passed could outlive stone. The Copper Age had revealed that the most enduring structures were not walls or roads, but understanding itself. Humanity began to build not only with earth and fire, but with memory. This realization reshaped how people valued one another. The elder who remembered a flood became as important as the hunter who brought meat. The craftsperson who refined a method mattered as much as the warrior who defended the village. Every role became essential within the web of continuity. Society grew less about dominance and more about interdependence. Even silence gained weight. Watching someone work became a form of learning. The angle of a wrist, the pause before striking, the way breath aligned with effort, these were teachings without words. Children absorbed knowledge simply by being near. The world taught through presence. Across time and distance, humanity became a living archive. No single mind held the whole story, but each carried a fragment. Together, those fragments formed civilization. The Copper Age had not centralized wisdom, it had distributed it, and in this distribution lay strength. When disaster came, memory remained. When walls fell, methods endured. When paths vanished, direction lived on in hands. Humanity no longer depended on a single place or leader. It depended on its ability to remember, to share, and to begin again. The first metal had taught people how to change stone. But more importantly, it had taught them how to change themselves, not once but forever. By the time humanity had learned to pass knowledge as naturally as breath, the world itself felt less vast and less cruel. Distance no longer meant separation. Time no longer meant loss. Every hearth became a point in a living constellation, each one glowing with the same inherited flame. The Copper Age had quietly transformed the planet into a network of beginnings. People no longer feared starting over. They understood that every ending carried within it the seed of another form. A village washed away by flood became the foundation of a wiser one upriver. A collapsed roof taught a stronger design. A broken blade inspired a better edge. The future grew from fragments of the past. This confidence reshaped how humanity faced the unknown. Storms still gathered. Earth still trembled, winters still bit, but these forces no longer felt like final judgments. They became messages, signals that adjustment was needed. The world spoke in wind and water, and people listened not with surrender but with curiosity. Communities began to speak of resilience not as resistance, but as harmony with change. To endure was not to remain unchanged. It was to respond, to adapt, to flow without forgetting. The Copper Age had taught that stability did not mean stillness. It meant balance through motion. Even fear evolved. It no longer froze, it guided. A shadow on the horizon became a reason to prepare. A dry riverbed became a reason to plan. The unknown no longer paralyzed, it invited thought. Humanity learned that awareness was a form of safety. In this way, the world became less a place of threats and more a place of questions. What if we build higher? What if we store more? What if we try again differently? Each question was a spark. Each spark carried the memory of fire. These sparks of questioning slowly reshaped the inner landscape of humanity. Curiosity became as natural as hunger. To wonder was no longer dangerous, it was expected. Children grew up surrounded by examples of change born from thought. A new channel cut where water once failed, a stronger roof replacing one that had fallen, a better tool emerging from the memory of a broken one. The world itself taught that improvement was possible. Communities began to speak in the language of next, not in urgency but in continuity. What comes after the harvest? What follows the winter? What should be built when this wall finally weakens? Time became something to converse with, not race against. People learned that the future did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded in small decisions made every day. The Copper Age had instilled a subtle courage, the courage to begin without certainty. No one could know if a new design would hold, if a new method would succeed, if a new path would lead to safety. Yet people tried, again and again. Fire taught them that every transformation risked failure. Metal taught them that failure could be reshaped. This courage softened rigidity. Traditions remained, but they breathed. They adapted. A method honored for generations could still be refined. A ritual could change its rhythm. A story could gain a new ending. Culture became alive rather than fixed. Even authority began to reflect this flexibility. Leaders were valued not only for strength, but for listening, for sensing when the old way no longer served, for guiding change without tearing continuity. Wisdom came to mean knowing when to hold and when to release. The Copper Age had not only taught humanity how to build, it had taught humanity how to evolve, not by breaking from the past, but by carrying it forward, slightly changed, slightly wiser each time. As this gentle courage spread, humanity began to experience time not as a force that swept life away, but as a space in which growth could occur. The future was no longer an abyss beyond sight. It became a field of possibility shaped by choice. Every hearth, every field, every workshop became a small horizon where tomorrow could be imagined and prepared. People learned to read the world the way a craftsperson reads metal, by subtle signs. The color of the sky before rain, the scent of soil before frost, the sound of a beam settling into place. These details became language. Nature spoke, and humanity listened not with fear but with readiness. The Copper Age had taught that attention itself was power. This attentiveness transformed everyday life. Meals were planned with seasons in mind. Homes were oriented toward wind and sun. Tools were shaped not only for strength, but for balance and comfort. Even rest became intentional, understood as part of creation rather than its absence. Life grew quieter, deeper, more deliberate. Communities began to sense that harmony was not stillness. It was alignment. To live well meant to move with the world's rhythms while gently shaping them. A canal did not fight the river, it guided it. A furnace did not oppose fire, it held it. Humanity learned that the most lasting changes were those that worked with what already existed. In this harmony, fear softened into awareness. People no longer waited for disaster to teach them. They observed, they anticipated, they adjusted. The world became less a series of surprises and more a pattern to be understood. The Copper Age had given humanity a new kind of sight, not the sight of eyes, but the sight of understanding, the ability to see what might be within what already is. With this new way of seeing, humanity no longer stood in opposition to change. It stood within it. Life became a practice of gentle adjustment, listening, shaping, releasing, and shaping again. The world was no longer a riddle to be solved once. It was a story to be read continuously, each day offering a new line. People began to understand that certainty was not required for meaning. One did not need to know how a path would end in order to take the next step. Fire itself taught this. It could not be fully predicted, only guided. Metal could not be forced, only persuaded. Creation became an act of trust, trust in process, in learning, in the ability to respond. This trust reshaped human emotion. Anxiety softened into preparation. Loss transformed into lesson. Change became expected rather than feared. The Copper Age had not removed hardship, but it had given hardship context. Every difficulty became part of a longer arc. Every ending hinted at a beginning. Communities grew less brittle. They no longer clung to a single form of life as if it were eternal. They held their ways with respect, yet allowed them to breathe. A village could move, a method could change, a story could gain a new meaning. Identity became fluid without dissolving. Continuity lived not in sameness, but in adaptation. In this world, even the unknown became companion rather than enemy. The horizon no longer whispered threat, it whispered possibility. Beyond it lay not only danger, but discovery. The future became a place humanity was willing to walk toward. The Copper Age had taught this most quietly, that the world does not demand certainty. It asks for attention, it asks for patience, it asks for the courage to begin again and again. By now, humanity had learned to live inside motion. Change no longer felt like interruption, it felt like breath. The world expanded and contracted, brightened and darkened, and people moved with it as naturally as rivers followed their banks. The Copper Age had taught that nothing meaningful was ever truly finished. Every form was a pause in an ongoing transformation. Across hills and plains, along rivers and coasts, life unfolded with a quiet confidence. People built knowing that what they raised might one day fall. They planted knowing that not every seed would rise. They taught knowing that students would go farther than teachers. Meaning no longer depended on permanence. It lived in participation. This perspective reshaped ambition. Greatness was no longer measured by what stood forever, but by what continued. A canal that guided water for generations mattered more than a tower that impressed for a moment. A method passed from hand to hand outlasted any monument. Humanity had learned that endurance belonged to process, not to form. Even memory softened. The past was no longer a weight to carry, it became a guide. People did not cling to what had been, they learned from it. Ruins were not only reminders of loss, they were teachers. They showed what had worked, what had failed, what might be tried differently. History became conversation rather than burden. The Copper Age had revealed that time itself was a material. It could be shaped by care. It could be wasted by neglect. It could be honored by attention. To live well now meant to move gently within this material, to shape without tearing, to change without forgetting, to act without pretending to control everything. Humanity no longer sought to stand above the world. It learned to stand within it. Standing within the world meant accepting its rhythms as partners rather than obstacles. Rain fell, crops failed, tools wore thin, yet none of these felt like final verdicts. They were part of a conversation that never truly ended. Each challenge carried within it a question, and every question invited response. Humanity had learned that life was not a problem to solve, but a process to engage. People began to notice how deeply this engagement shaped their inner lives. Frustration softened into reflection. Impatience matured into timing. Even grief found space within continuity. Loss no longer felt like disappearance alone, it felt like a turning point in a longer arc. A broken vessel became new clay, a fallen beam became firewood, an abandoned home became shelter for another. Endings learned to feed beginnings. Communities grew skilled at letting go without surrendering meaning. They did not cling to every wall or method as sacred. They honored what had served and released what no longer did. Tradition became a living current rather than a rigid form. The Copper Age had taught them that reverence and change could coexist. This balance nurtured resilience. Villages rebuilt after storms with wiser hands. Fields were replanted with altered patterns. Tools were reshaped with subtle improvements. Each cycle carried forward a trace of learning. The world itself became a teacher, and humanity became its attentive student. In this way, life gained depth without heaviness. People no longer felt crushed by the passage of time. They felt accompanied by it. Every day became both continuation and beginning. Each dawn carried the echo of ancient fires and the promise of new ones. The Copper Age had given humanity a rare gift, the ability to live inside change without being lost by it. As humanity grew comfortable within this flowing world, a quiet wisdom began to settle into daily life. People no longer hurried to define themselves against time. They learned instead to move with it. Morning light became an invitation rather than a demand. Evening shadow became reflection rather than fatigue. Each day unfolded as part of a longer rhythm that stretched beyond any single life. This rhythm shaped how people treated one another. Patience replaced urgency. Listening became as valued as speaking. Elders were honored not only for age but for perspective. They had seen cycles return. They had watched storms pass and fields recover. Their presence reminded others that nothing was truly final. Even the harshest season eventually softened. Communities learned to breathe together. Work followed the sun. Rest followed labor. Celebration followed survival. Rituals marked transitions, birth, maturity, departure, not as abrupt breaks but as passages within a continuous flow. Life felt less fragmented. Each stage belonged to the next. The Copper Age had planted this sense of wholeness. By teaching humanity to shape the world, it had taught humanity to recognize itself within it. People no longer felt separate from the forces around them. Fire, water, stone, and wind became companions in an unfolding story. Every action became a response within a larger dialogue. Even conflict began to change in this light. Disagreement no longer meant rupture, it became part of adjustment. People learned that tension, like heat in a furnace, could refine rather than destroy. When held with care, difference became strength. The world itself demonstrated this truth. Mountains formed through pressure, rivers carved valleys through persistence. In this way, humanity matured, not into mastery, but into participation. The Copper Age had not crowned humanity ruler of the earth. It had taught humanity how to belong within it. Belonging changed the way humanity looked at its own reflection in the world. People no longer felt like strangers walking across borrowed land. They felt woven into the same fabric as stone and sky. Every footprint became a signature, every hearth a conversation. The world did not stand apart, it answered. This sense of belonging softened the sharp edges of ambition. Success was no longer measured only by expansion or dominance. It was measured by harmony, by how well a community could endure without exhausting its soil, by how gently a river could be guided without being broken, by how knowledge could be shared without being lost. Progress became a form of care. Children grew up learning that creation carried responsibility. They watched elders tend fires patiently. They saw fields rested when soil grew tired. They learned that every gain required balance. The Copper Age had taught that power without listening led to fracture. Fire must be held, metal must be guided, change must be accompanied by wisdom. Even dreams began to change shape. People no longer dreamed only of conquest or escape. They dreamed of stability, of continuity, of worlds where their descendants could live well. Hope became intergenerational. It stretched beyond personal desire into collective future. The horizon no longer whispered only of distance. It whispered of those who would stand there one day. humanity learned to imagine lives beyond its own, and in that imagination, something extraordinary occurred. The future became a shared space, not a mystery to fear, not a prize to seize, but a home still being built. The Copper Age had not ended with a new metal. It ended when humanity learned to walk gently into tomorrow. At last, humanity stood at the edge of something it could not yet name. The world was familiar yet transformed. Fires burned in every land, paths crossed valleys and seas, knowledge moved faster than feet. The Copper Age had carried people from instinct into intention, from survival into participation, from wandering into becoming. No single moment marked this arrival. There was no trumpet of change, no final hearth that closed the age. Instead, it happened quietly, the way dawn happens, light gathering so slowly that no one can say when night truly ended. People simply realized one day that they were no longer only living in the world, they were shaping it. A child watching molten metal flow no longer saw mystery alone. They saw possibility. A farmer planting seed did not only hope for rain, they planned for harvest. A builder raising a wall did not think only of shelter, they imagined generations. The future had entered human thought as something real. This was the Copper Age's final gift, not a tool. Not a weapon, not a city, but a way of seeing. Humanity now understood that the world was unfinished, and that this was not a flaw. It was an invitation. Every mountain still held secrets. Every river still offered new paths. Every generation still carried questions that had never been asked before. Fire had taught humans that matter could change. Copper had taught them that change could be guided. Time had taught them that guidance could endure. Standing here at the quiet threshold of everything that would follow, humanity did not feel powerful in the way storms are powerful. It felt powerful in the way seeds are powerful, small, patient, certain that growth was possible. And so the first metal dream reached its gentle conclusion, not with an ending, but with a beginning that would never truly stop. The world was no longer something that happened to humanity. It was something humanity would continue to make. In this new awareness, the night itself felt different. Darkness no longer meant helplessness. Fires glowed in homes across valleys and coasts, answering one another like distant stars. Somewhere always a hearth burned. Somewhere hands shaped, repaired, prepared. The world felt inhabited in every direction, not by noise but by quiet intention. People began to sense that they were never truly alone. Even in the most distant places, the same gestures were being repeated, the careful stacking of wood, the tending of embers, the shaping of clay, the lifting of tools. Across mountains and seas, humanity moved in shared rhythm. The Copper Age had taught that connection did not require closeness. It required continuity. This realization softened solitude. A traveler resting beneath unfamiliar skies could light a fire and know that others, unseen, were doing the same. The act itself became companionship. To shape, to build, to prepare, these were universal movements binding lives that would never meet into a single unfolding story. The world grew quieter, not emptier. Silence filled with meaning. The wind through trees carried memory. The glow of coals held promise. Every place became capable of becoming home. The earth no longer felt vast and indifferent. It felt receptive. Humanity had learned that it belonged not because it owned the world, but because it participated in it. The land did not need to be conquered to be known. It needed to be listened to, worked with, remembered. And so, as night settled across hills and rivers, across deserts and forests, a calm understanding spread that tomorrow could be shaped. That loss could become lesson. That effort could become legacy. The first metal dream did not fade into darkness. It became the light by which humanity learned to walk forward slowly, gently together. As the long echo of the first metal dream settles, the world itself seems to exhale. Rivers continue their patient journeys. Mountains remain in silent watch. Forests sway in rhythms older than memory. Yet within this ancient stillness, something new endures, a quiet human presence that no longer feels temporary. Humanity has learned to stay, not in one place, but within the flow of change itself. To build without freezing the future, to move without losing the past, to shape without forgetting the cost of shaping. The Copper Age has left behind a consciousness that lives far beyond copper, a way of being that listens before acting, that prepares before demanding, that remembers while reaching forward. Every village fire, every workshop glow, every lamp lit against night now carries that inheritance. It is present in the way hands pause before striking, in the way fields are left to rest, in the way elders are asked before walls are raised. It is present in restraint, in foresight, in care. The world no longer feels like a stage where humanity performs briefly before vanishing. It feels like a home under constant construction, shaped by countless hands across time. Each generation enters not as a stranger, but as a builder invited into an ancient project, and that project is simple: to live, to learn, to leave the ground kinder than it was found. The Copper Age has taught that progress does not need to roar. It can whisper, it can glow softly in the dark, it can pass quietly from hand to hand, century to century. In that gentle glow, humanity continues, not as master of the world, but as its thoughtful companion. And so the first metal dream does not end, it becomes the way forward. And now, as this long journey through the first metal dream draws gently to a close, the world grows quiet once more. The fires that once flickered in ancient valleys soften into embers, rivers slow in moonlight. Hills rest beneath stars. The voices of countless generations fade into a single, steady breath. You have walked with them, those first hands beside a hearth, those travelers across plains, those builders of canals and cities, those quiet teachers who passed knowledge forward without ever knowing how far it would reach. Their world became yours. Their questions became your inheritance. Their courage to try became the rhythm beneath everything that followed. The Copper Age did not end in triumph or collapse. It ended in understanding, in the realization that the world is not finished, that it listens, that it can be shaped with care. That tomorrow is something we enter, not something that arrives. And so, as your own night deepens, you may let these ancient fires dim into rest. Let the valleys settle, let the rivers drift, let history grow soft again. If you wish to continue drifting through time, other gentle journeys await you here on Somni Kron, sleep-friendly stories that wander through forgotten ages, quiet civilizations, and calm, ancient worlds. Each one is crafted to carry you gently toward rest, just as this one has. For now, allow the first metal dream to fade into warmth. The embers glow. The world rests, and you may rest too.